Hello everyone, I'm Midnight Storyteller. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know you're watching to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Midnight at the Mountains of Mourne. I remember the first time I saw the Mourne Mountains in the mist. It was a Friday, just after the rain had passed, and the clouds were still clinging to the peaks like a shroud over a corpse. I was young then, just 15, but already too familiar with the violent world of Northern Ireland, a world that made your skin crawl and your heart beat like a drum at night. The troubles were in full swing, and the air was thick with fear, suspicion, and the crackle of gunfire. It was my Uncle Dan who first took me to the mountains. He was a quiet man, the kind whose silence made you nervous, as if he were hiding something just out of reach. He was a big man, broad-shouldered with hands that looked like they could break a neck in a second. I'd always known that Dan was involved in things my mother warned me to stay away from, even if she didn't say it outright. "We're going to the Mountains of Mourne tomorrow at dusk," he'd said, his voice low and grave, like a whisper from the grave itself. Some business that needs attending to. I didn't ask questions. No one did, not with the way things were at the time. My cousins had been involved with the IRA for years, but Dan, though he wasn't as vocal about it, was tied to the underground. In ways most people couldn't imagine. I just knew that if he said business, you did it, no matter what. His calls were cryptic, but they were never ignored. We drove out of Belfast in the early evening, the sky darkening like the bruises on a child's skin. As we got closer to the mountains, the landscape began to twist and change. The rolling hills gave way to jagged rocks and cliffs that seemed to claw at the sky. It was like a place out of time, untouched by anything human. We parked the car by a small stone wall, the engine's dying hum mixing with the faint sounds of birds calling from the trees. Dan didn't say a word as we climbed over the wall and made our way up the rough path that led into the hills. The air was colder now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. We passed the ruins of old stone cottages, their windows shattered, their roofs caved in. Remnants of a time long gone, but not a time before the British had come, I knew. Every step seemed to echo in the emptiness, like the mountains themselves were watching us. Eventually, after a long, wordless hike, we went off the course up to the peak, instead veering into the woods in a slightly flatter area. A few minutes later, we reached a small clearing, a patch of land where the grass grew tall and wild. There were trees in every direction, but where we stood, we could see clearly up to the night sky. In the center of the clearing, there were a bunch of large rocks of about the same size. Some toppled over in a vague circle. But the way the ground was devoted in some spots and shaped around the rocks told me that at some point in time, they must have been placed more uniformly. Dan stopped, his eyes scanning the murky woods. He pulled something from his jacket, a package wrapped in brown paper, and laid it carefully on the ground. "Wait here," he muttered. I didn't argue. I knew better than to ask questions. But something about the place set my nerves on edge. It was as if the land itself was alive and it didn't want us there. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the faint crackling of static in the air, as if the mountains themselves were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I turned my back for just a moment, trying to steady my breath, and that's when I heard it. A voice, low and guttural like a growl or a murmur coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Dan," I breathed, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. My eyes scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. My heart raced. I wasn't sure if I'd heard it at all or if the stress of the situation had finally gotten to me. But I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on my chest. I could hear the wind pick up, swirling, around us in a frenzy. And then I saw it. It was a figure, that much I could make out. It was standing out in the trees, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Dan," I said again, but the words came out strangled, as if something had lodged in my chest. My uncle was still standing by the package, his back turned to me, unaware. The figure in the trees moved closer. It moved in an unnatural way. You know how in older video games characters don't exactly walk? They sort of just glide forward while displaying a walking animation. It was like that. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move, as if the mountains themselves had taken root in my bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, like it had melted back into the earth. "Come on, lad," Dan called, his voice flat. "Job's done." I blinked, my heart still pounding, and when I looked up again, the clearing was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. My mind was spinning, but I forced myself to walk over to my uncle. He gave me a sharp look, but I said nothing. There were a lot of things you just didn't talk about in Northern Ireland back then. Later, when we were driving back down the mountain road, I asked him, almost against my will, who was that man? Was he one of ours? Dan didn't answer at first. He just kept his eyes on the road, the headlights cutting through the mist like two white knives. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Not everything that roams these lands is part of our society, of our factions, lad. Some things never left, and some things, they come back. Forget about tonight. What happened tonight stays here, up in the Mourns." I didn't ask any more questions after that. But I've never forgotten the look in his eyes that night, the terror behind them. Not then, not now, and not 5 years later. When I returned to that place, I joined the IRA in 1973, as soon as I turned 18. The troubles were in full bloom, each day a new round of bloodshed and madness. In the streets of Belfast, you couldn't go a day without hearing the crack of gunfire or the screech of tires as another bomb went off. You could feel it in the air, a tension so thick it seemed to press down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. People looked at each other like they were waiting for a reason to pull a trigger. It was the kind of place that could make even the toughest man turn soft, or worse, make him tough in ways you didn't want to know. And for a long time I knew I wanted to fight for our cause. Back then, I would have died for a united Ireland, without hesitation. But that changed when I returned to the mountains of Mourne. It was the winter of '76, the year everything started to spiral out of control. The British had made it clear that they weren't backing down, and neither were we. The war had become a game of attrition, tit-for-tat ambushes, bombings, checkpoints, and killings. The usual. I was a lieutenant in the Belfast unit at the time, just a kid by the standards of the older men. But I had a reputation. You didn't make it as far as I did without learning how to kill with precision, how to move in silence, how to erase every trace of your presence in the world. But that wasn't what mattered to the ones who called the shots. What mattered was my loyalty. And when they said jump, I jumped. "Tommy," said Callahan, one of the senior men in the barracks, his eyes burning with some fever I couldn't place. He was a hard bastard, the kind who didn't flinch at much. His face was a craggy map of scars, the kind of man you wanted on your side if things went south. "You're going up to the Mourns tomorrow night. There's a job for you, a special one, just you." I remember the weight of his words, the way he said it, like it wasn't a question but a command. There wasn't a shred of doubt in his voice. I nodded, not wanting to ask too many questions. I remember thinking it was odd being sent alone. I'd always been part of a team, guys you could rely on when the shots rang out, but not this time. Callahan didn't give me much more than that. Just a nod, a brief handshake, and a look that told me not to ask questions. I didn't. That's how things worked. You didn't ask, you just did. And yes, of course, I'd always harbored a weird feeling towards the mountains of Mourne. Even though I had stowed away the memories of my visit to the place with my uncle 5 years ago in some corner of my brain, the idea of returning to the place filled me with dread. I didn't like it. But that didn't matter. I had orders. About a month passed and the date of the mission rolled around. I packed light, a pistol, a spare mag, a grenade, and a map of the area. Sure, I knew what the objective was. go to the location on the mountain chosen by the information broker and collect the document. But in truth, I had no idea what I was really walking into. None of us ever really did. But Callahan was always able to remind us that it wasn't just one mission, one robbery, or one shootout. It was a war, no matter what label the Brits put on it. And when a man like that tells you to do something, you just do it. I grabbed my pack and made the long drive down the narrow roads toward the mountains, the sky bruised purple with the coming night. As I came to the outskirts of Belfast, the night grew wet and cold. The rain beat down on the windshield, like it was angry, like the weather itself was trying to stop me. But I didn't care, I was used to it. As the city faded behind me, the air grew heavier. That was around the time the weight of things settled in my chest. Back to that place, back to the mountains of fucking Mourne. I drove through Newry, but it wasn't long before the familiar roads fell away and the land opened up in front of me. A cold, dark expanse of rocky terrain, blanketed in mist. The Mournes rising high and impossible, looming over me, an old nightmare I couldn't wake from. When I arrived at the foot of Slieve Donard, the highest peak, I left the car parked by the side of the road and started on foot. The night had already swallowed the daylight, and the mountains seemed to hold their breath as I walked. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence pressed against me like a physical thing. There was no wind, no sound of animals, no rustling of the trees. It was as though the mountain itself was waiting, watching. As I climbed the trail, the mist grew thicker, curling around me like a living thing, a slow-moving fog that swallowed everything in its path. The crunch of my boots against the stones was the only sound for miles. The mountains stretched ahead of me, vast and cold, their peaks shrouded in the darkness of night. Every step felt heavier, like the land itself was pulling me down. I didn't know why I was here, why this was the location chosen by an information broker. I'd asked Callahan once a few weeks back when the orders first came through, but he just gave me that look, the one that told me to keep my mouth shut. "You'll understand when you get there," he said. And that was all. I knew the terrain well enough. I'd done plenty of jobs in the various hills around Belfast, plenty of walking through fog and shadow, and I'd never forgotten that night with Dan years ago. It scared me. I feel no shame in admitting it, but orders were orders. This felt different from any mission before, though. There was something about the air, something about the way the landscape seemed to close in on me, that made me feel like prey. I reached the spot the map marked for my destination by the time the moon was full overhead, casting long, thin shadows across the ground. An open area close to the very peak of the mountain. I paused for a moment, my senses on edge, but I forced myself to walk towards the center. My orders were clear: meet the contact, get the information, and return. That was, there are no questions, quiet, no fuss. The fog was so dense up here that I genuinely couldn't know for certain if the person I was sent to meet was there or not. But as I hesitantly made my way forward, something changed. The air thickened, the temperature dropping even further, until I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. I didn't understand it. The cold wasn't normal. It wasn't just winter cold, it was a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet and encompassed me up to the tip of my scalp. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, and ancient. Tommy McGrath. I froze. It wasn't a human voice, it was older. It came from the earth itself, from the stones. It was as though the mountain was speaking directly to me. My heart raced, my hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at my side. Tommy, the voice repeated. You've been chosen. The words echoed in my head, vibrating through my bones. Chosen for what? I whispered, not meaning to speak aloud, but unable to stop myself. The mist swirled around me, thickening, until I could barely see the hand in front of my face. A figure emerged from the fog, a man, tall and thin, dressed in black. His face was hidden in shadow, but I knew it was him. Callahan, it had to be. You've come. Callahan's voice came from the figure, but it wasn't quite his voice. It was deeper, older. "It's time." "Time for what?" I demanded. Stepping back, my grip tightening on the gun. "What the hell's going on here, Callahan?" He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming like coal in the dim light. And then he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile I'd ever seen on him before. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't, something you could never know. A smile that was as old as the hills themselves. "You've been chosen, Tommy," he said again, this time with a slow, deliberate drawl. "For the final stage of the war. The war you don't understand yet." I stared at him, not sure if he was speaking in riddles or if I was just losing my mind in the mountains. "Listen, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, but this isn't funny. Where's the contact?" "There is no contact," Callahan said, his voice suddenly cold. "There never was. What in God's name are you playing at?" But Callahan didn't answer. Instead, the fog around us thickened again, and the ground beneath my feet trembled. The stones of the circle began to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from within them. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but the fear in my chest held me in place. "You've been part of this all along, Tommy," Callahan continued, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You were chosen before you even knew what was happening. The mountains have chosen you. The war was never just about politics or even blood. It's about something much older." I shook my head, trying to process his words. But they didn't make sense. The Troubles wasn't a war for gods or for land. This was a war for the Irish people, a war for survival. "You've been feeding it," Callahan said, as though reading my thoughts. "The blood, the violence, the hatred. The Mourns have fed on it for centuries. You and all the others like you are just the latest offering." The stone circle began to tremble, and the figures in the fog moved closer. Callahan stepped forward, and I realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't one of us. He was one of them, a servant of whatever dark force had been awakened in the Mourn. A force that fed on blood, on war, on the sacrifices we made without even knowing it. He grinned again. "You've been feeding it, Tommy, and now it's time for you to give it what it wants." With that, the fog closed in further. I reached for my gun, ready to blow a hole through Callahan, but he'd already sunk back into the fog, and I never saw him again, not after all these years. I stumbled after him but lost my way, running blindly, and eventually I realized that I was lying to myself if I believed I was chasing him. I was really running away in fear. I used to think the scariest thing in the world was the guy in the streets of Belfast who would shoot you without a thought. But I was wrong. I hadn't felt fear like this before in my life. I kept running downhill and found my way into a wooded area. It wasn't long before I came upon a clearing, a wide space where there were no trees. And then, to my absolute horror, I realized where I really was. There in the middle was the old stone circle, where Dan took me all those years ago. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stones in total helplessness. In the dim light of the moon, I realized that the stones were different from how I remembered them. I could see faint markings on them, symbols I couldn't understand, and words in Old Gaelic I couldn't translate. Under British occupation, we were never taught our country's own language. They were the kind of things you might expect to find on a tombstone or a forgotten altar. It was as if someone had carved them into the rocks long ago, as if the earth itself had grown old with them, even though I knew they'd been placed sometime in the last 5 years. Then I heard it. A voice, low, rumbling like a growl from deep beneath the earth. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. The voice didn't sound like a man or even a human at all. It was as if the mountain itself had spoken, the words carried on the wind, vibrating in my chest. My breath caught, and I gripped the gun at my side, but then, through the fog, I saw a movement. Figures, tall and gaunt, slipping in and out of the mist. They weren't quite people, more like shadows, their bodies flickering like candle flames caught in a gust of wind. They moved without sound, without footsteps, their faces obscured by the fog. My heart hammered in my chest. Leave now, or You'll never leave. I spun around. There, just outside the stone circle, staring straight at me from just a meter or two away, was a man, or at least what looked like one. His clothes were tattered, like he'd been out here for years, and his face was impossibly pale, almost milk white, as though he hadn't seen the sun in decades. His eyes were dark, not the kind of dark you'd expect, but great black orbs in his sockets with no visible iris, pupils, or white parts. Even hunched over, he towered over me, his arms hanging down to almost his shins, and his voice was the same as the growl. It came from somewhere deep inside him, like it was being pulled out by something far older than him. "You've trespassed on sacred ground, soldier," he whispered. "You don't belong here. You were never meant to find us." And then I understood. The man wasn't human. No, not exactly. He was something far older, something tied to the land, to the mountains themselves. He wasn't here by choice. He was a part of the Mourns, a part of the ancient earth that had seen too much bloodshed, too many sacrifices, too much history soaked into the soil, and I had just walked into the middle of it. "Don't you see?" he said, low and rasping as he drew closer to me. "This land has known war long before the likes of your armies ever set foot on it. It's soaked in the blood of those who died here, in battles you'll never understand. And now you're part of it." I stumbled back, the weight of his words sinking in. The mountains, the stones, the fog, everything around me seemed alive now, as though the earth itself was watching me, judging me. The men I had killed, the bombs I had planted, the lives I had taken. Suddenly it all felt like a grain of sand in an ocean of blood, meaningless against the weight of something far darker. "You'll never leave, Tommy," the being whispered again. And for the first time, I felt it, the pull. It wasn't just in my head, it was physical, like the earth itself was reaching for me, drawing me into the stones, into the silence of the mountains. For a moment I stood there, my mind spinning, my body frozen, and then the truth hit me like a slap to the face. This wasn't about a simple message. It wasn't about the IRA, or the war, or Callahan, or some mission. It was about something far older, far darker than anything I'd ever known. The Mourns weren't just mountains. They were a place of power, a place of blood, a place where the past never died, and I had trespassed. I had disturbed the land. The fog began to swirl, faster now, the whispers louder, more insistent. I could feel the cold grip of the mountain on my chest, and I knew I would never leave this place. Not really. More and more figures flickered in and out of my peripheral vision in the fog as the impossible being I was facing took a final step forward and looked at me. His almost mummified, haunting face twisted into an expression of what seemed to be pity. "You were never meant to leave," he rasped, quieter now despite him being right in front of me. "You'll be lost for as long as you live, tied to this place. You and I and those who are here already and those to come." I blinked and suddenly the fog was completely gone. The wraith-like thing swirling in it disappeared with it. But not whoever I was speaking to. Before my eyes he remained. "Please leave now, soldier. You may be lucky enough to not lose yourself." And with that, he turned around and slowly walked away unnaturally, back into the trees. As I turned and ran, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, I felt the darkness closing in around my mind. The mountain's voice echoed in my ears, a low, suffocating hum. "You were never meant to leave." And when I finally looked back, all I saw was the fog and the cold, empty stones of the Mourn Mountains. And I knew then that I was lost. Forever. I've lived a long life, left the IRA, started a family, and made the best of the world despite the things I'd done as a soldier. But through all of it, the call of the mountains has never left me, never given my mind true peace. The mountains of Mourn want me to come back, and I don't know how long I'll be able to resist their pull. My wife's been dead just over a year now. My son never came back from America for longer than a week at a time once he finished college, and moved there to pursue some dream or the other. I'm just an old man with declining health living alone on the same old Belfast street, and the morns haunt me more than ever before. I fear the day I'll give in and give myself to the mountains, let them take me fully, but I often wonder if maybe they already have. The war was never meant to end. It was meant to feed the darkness. Forever. Sudden flourish. Under gravel and twisting roots there lies an intricate system of life, hundreds of sizes smaller than our species. Like pale, empty veins, they stretch out to dig downwards into damp soil. It is dark, darker than sunless skies. The realm underground is the realm of corpses. They settle between debris like shells pushed under sand by careless ocean waves. Deeper and deeper, while you walk overhead on solid ground, thinking of the casual facets of life. Corpses are clawing overhead themselves, grasping those roots and pulling at them with a vengeful desperation to return to life. We never hear their wailing, but the earth's surface shakes with their conviction. Ghosts are known to protest against going quietly. If they were wrongfully put to sleep, they will show no hesitation to express indignation. Rightfully so. If your life ended too soon, you would travel to the sun and bring it down with you. This is just the self-righteous nature of mankind. We feel that we are the special exception and are meant for greater things than the natural course of life. We feel there are no accidents. We do not forgive unfortunate circumstances. We do not accept them. Unlike the animal kingdom, we fight to live for more than survival and procreation. We want to exist and make a name for ourselves. While some may envy the beasts for their simpler motivations, most men appreciate the chance to do something greater in life. Thus, understandably, when we die prematurely, it is a serious offense to our entire existence. It is even worse to be betrayed by another human at the cost of your life. It feels as if God himself has turned his creations on each other. You question the sanity of the offender. Who would, with the very same passion for life, take that away from someone just like themselves? In a sense, it is like killing an extension of oneself. Like taking an axe and swinging at your comrade as if you weren't a tree yourself in a forest realm. But what hurts more than an active aid in murder? The opposite, in fact. What may be perhaps the worst experience concerning death among others is the refusal to save a man's life. Passiveness, to be witnessed in peril and receive no help at all. It is more dismaying than the rest of life's outcomes, especially knowing there was indeed a chance for survival. A great chance at that. For those who die at the hand of none but feel killed by the world, I share a great sympathy. Of course, I am not dead myself, but I can understand to a degree what rage could be incited in an individual should he experience this firsthand. I have even seen the terrible consequences of a fate never to be avenged. I think back now to the terror I escaped not more than a year ago. Have you ever passed by an empty garden or a greenhouse, fogged with sun-bleached windows that obscure what should only be innocuous plants inside, and felt a dull dread? You may have felt an indescribable sadness that you cannot rationalize, though it was not strong enough to remark. Most people do not realize this phenomenon until it is brought to their attention. It can be confidently said that this is none other than your faithful intuition kicking into gear with a plea for avoidance. Do not distrust your own mind. I write to whom it may concern in an effort to provide desperate advice. I come bearing a warning of some explanation to these instinctual senses. Knowing the potential danger lurking within such unassuming spaces will grant you patience with the manner in which I speak about the matter at hand. Consider now the inherent fear you have of suddenly no longer existing in this world, leaving without a trace for anyone to track down and recover you. You would only be known by what you'd left behind, what you perhaps contributed. If there is little to show for, your name will be all people can hearken. It is dreadful, no? The most existential species of phobia. I can save you from but one dimension in which this will happen. Though, when all is said and done, a resulting consequence is that you will be undesirably aware of every botanical space you pass by. Petals will make you shudder at the sight of them. Ivy that hangs over stone and brick and wood will induce a paranoid brush on the back of the neck. The price of your hope for survival is constant anxiety for the worst. Are you taking this moment to recall the last place you've seen? Wherever you may roam, you must take precise caution in coming across a garden or greenhouse. There is a secret peril hiding in a great many of them. This will be especially difficult to avoid. If the secret peril does await in one of those places, you will be able to identify it by a nagging, gravitational energy. My first word of advice is to avoid encountering situations where you must be alone. Your solitude will become your first enemy. Man's independence has always been the downfall of many who take preference in secluding themselves. However, I understand that sometimes it is unavoidable. Thus, with the utmost digression, I implore you, if you are ever alone in a garden, greenhouse, or arboretum, whatever it may be, and find yourself discovering a botanical journal with an embossed symbol of a golden flower, you are never to open it. Though it appears curious with its many embellishments of thin metal and fine crafted leather, the appearance is the single most pleasant thing you will find about it. Never mind what curiosities you may have about the contents. Abandon all interest immediately. Should you open it, your days of autonomy will end upon reading the first page. That is all it will take to enact a bout of sudden possession. You will feel compelled to continue reading against your better judgment, and while you do, the ghost in that book will dawn. He will emerge from that wretched journal. Against futile protest, he shall pass his long accrued grudge of being left to rot among the flowers unto you. A curse will strike your soul. It will transform you most terribly, both physically and into sheer madness. I hesitate to tell you the specifics of the curse, but I suspect that knowing the dismaying details will more effectively dissuade you. How I wish I did not know the outcome. I can see it so vividly in hindsight. That colleague I once knew with such acuity and all his life's moments, gone in a flash, replaced by something tenfold more terrible. How I wish that I could die instead. Of live with the bleak memory of this wretched phenomenon. If only I were not equally gripped with the inevitable will to survive as all human men are. Instead, it plagues me with confliction. The curse, it will spread, slowly but progressively, at such a rate that by the time you notice anything wrong, it will be too late. The flesh in your body will become more and more akin to soil, while you grip the book with an alien force unbelonging to you, churning and softening like butter. Stems and leaves are known to grow from an unknown source beneath muscle and bone, pushing rather forcefully with bulbed heads. I can only conjecture to describe this as I would fast-growing tumors. I wince at any extra use of words to expand upon the already gruesome event. Quickly will they flourish from the surface of your skin. Soon after, they will bloom at a supernatural pace. Flowers will grow out from your body, arms, legs, stomach, head. Out of all the flowers surrounding you, you will be the most splendid specimen. To those who did not know you were once a mortal being, they will find out quite hauntingly beautiful, resembling in the subtlest way a human form. Your contouring will appear bloated underneath a sloppy amalgamation of flowers, and you will stand rigid. You will stand silent. You will be left wondering what mad spirit would bestow such an unfair punishment on an innocent observer. Wondering will be the last thing you ever do. From witnesses and historical memory alone, the journal has been identified as that of a renowned botanist, I am afeared to utter his name, who dedicated the entirety of his life to studying rare and exotic plants. Tragically, he was betrayed by his peers and left to die in the very garden he loved. You understand now why a man would ever be so bitter. Perhaps, though, his peers had seen something sinister in the man's work that will never be recovered. Nobody knows what is written in the journal, whether it has anything to do with plants at all for that matter. All that is assured is his name scrawled on the inside of the cover page. By the time you become a curious mass of golden, pulsing flowers that will eventually decay into the ground, the book will have disappeared without a trace. At that moment, you will be left with nothing but the memory of the words that plagued you. My admonition ends just as quickly as those final moments. Tag your IT. Yeah, I used to think grown-ups always knew what was right. They seemed to have all the answers, like they were in control of everything. Back then, I thought there were rules for how things worked, even in little moments, like the way someone should look at you or how a touch was supposed to feel. But nobody ever explained what it meant when something felt different, when a look lingered too long or a hand stayed where it shouldn't. I didn't know back then. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. I was just a kid. I was just 8. Reuben was my best friend's neighbor. He was older, maybe 17, and that was the best part. He was older. He didn't want to hang out with the little kids, but he did. He came over and played with us sometimes. He'd play tag. It was fun. It was always fun. I thought he was cool because he was older, and all the older kids seemed like they knew more about the world. They were bigger, faster, and just better at everything. But now I remember it differently. It started like a normal game of tag. The sun was hot on my back, and I could feel the dirt sticking to my knees. My best friend was running beside me, laughing. We'd run around the yard for hours, getting sweaty and tired, but still wanting more. We were good at it, or so I thought. I thought we were fast, and Reuben, he was always it. Always chasing us, laughing like it was the best game ever. He was faster than us, but we liked it. He was the older kid, he made it exciting. When he tagged us, he always said the same thing. "Tag, you're it." His hand would pat my back, and it felt like a normal game. He was bigger, sure, but it didn't matter. He didn't always play with us. He didn't have to. He was Reuben, after all. But when he did, it felt special. It felt like he was letting us in on something, like we were part of something bigger. I didn't know that the rules were different for him. I don't remember when the game started to feel off. It wasn't like one big thing happened. It was small at first, tiny things that didn't seem like anything at all. But I started to feel his eyes on me. And I'd feel this cold shiver run down my spine when he looked at me too long. When his hand lingered on my shoulder just a little too much. I didn't understand why, but something told me it wasn't just a game anymore. I didn't play much after that. I stayed inside, pretending I was busy. I felt weird whenever Reuben came around, so I started avoiding him. But my best friend didn't. He kept playing even when I didn't. Reuben kept coming around, and my best friend kept running after him. Always happy, always smiling, never noticing anything was wrong. As the years passed, Reuben faded from my life. My family moved to another part of town, and I never saw him again. But the memory lingered, gnawing at me, whispering in the back of my mind every time I saw someone too eager, too friendly, too close. Though I wish I had stayed. I wish I had told my best friend. But I didn't. I let him go. I let Reuben stay. In his life. It wasn't until much later that my best friend first told me what happened. He, who had always been too trusting, told me one evening when we were older. He was crying, his voice shaking as he confessed what Reuben had done to him, how Reuben had touched him, how Reuben had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, the things that Reuben made him do when no one else was around. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. I couldn't understand how the person I hoped was just playing could hurt someone, could be capable of things so vulgar. But when he finally said it out loud, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I had known. Deep down, I had always known. I had felt it in my gut, in the way Reuben had looked at me. I had felt the coldness in his touch, the way he made me feel like I was his to chase, to catch, to do whatever he wanted. I don't know what hurt more, the fact that I didn't say anything when I had the chance to, or the fact that I didn't see it, didn't realize it, when I should have known. I should have told him to stop, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was just a kid. And now when I think back to those days, I don't even remember the games. I don't remember the laughter. I remember the way Reuben's smile didn't feel right, the way his touch felt like something else, like something darker. I remember feeling trapped even when I was running, but it was too late to say anything now. It was too late to stop it. I never told anyone what happened. Not really. Not the way I should have. What would I have said? I was just a kid. I wonder if I'd stayed longer, if I'd watched closer. Would I have seen what was truly happening? Could I have saved him? Or did Reuben already have him, already have both of us, caught in a game we couldn't escape? I'll never know if he's free of it. If I'm free of it, maybe Reuben was the game. Maybe the whole time it was always about us. Always about how far we would go, how long we would run, before we realized there was nowhere to hide. But I'll never know for sure. And maybe that's the worst part. Because now, every time I turn a corner, every time I hear a voice that sounds too familiar, I wonder if I'm still running. I wonder if it's still his game. And I wonder if one day I'll be it again. The armator Parker was lucky to get an apartment with his father's credit card. However, not only would Parker need to find some way to pay it off, but if the authorities found out, he'd be put in an orphanage. Parker was only 13. Parker stepped out of the bathroom and fixed his gaze on his baseball bat. Parker recalled what the police had stated regarding his sister's visit to the hospital prior to when she went insane. The hospital was suspicious and strange. The cops didn't trust it. Parker had pretended to have a living grandparent in order to keep himself from being placed in an orphanage. Parker believed that her insanity might be related to the hospital. After grabbing his bat, he left the apartment. He would look into it and discover something, a closure of sorts. The hospital was located on the outskirts of town. It was convenient for his family, but Parker always thought the hospital was strange. The staff was always carrying bags that smelled like rotten flesh. Parker was repeatedly told that it was only donated organs. Parker noticed the hospital in sight. It had been abandoned for several days, most likely due to the deaths of patients and doctors. Parker pushed the front door open. "Hello, is anyone there?" yelled Parker. He wasn't sure why he tried. There was no one there. Maybe a few squatters, but other than that, no one. Parker sighed and continued moving forward. Parker decided to go to the hospital administrator's office. The paint on the walls was peeling off, and Parker had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Parker eventually made it to the administrator's office, where he attempted to unlock the door, but found it jammed. Parker pressed his body into the door, which eventually relented and opened. Parker coughed as the dust filled his lungs. Parker examined the administrator's desk and saw a stack of documents. Parker walked up to the desk and examined the documents. It discussed selling the organs of the crazy patients. Parker could not believe it. This hospital attempted to sell the organs of people suffering from mental health issues. Parker stepped back. Was the hospital going to do that to his sister? Parker stared at the clock on the wall, and the minute and hour hands started moving backwards. As Parker looked at the desk, he was tackled by a shadowy figure wearing a white mask with a gaping black smile. Upon getting up, he saw that he was not in the hospital, but rather in a pitch-black emptiness with a rough stone floor. Parker held up his baseball bat and walked forward. "Hello?" yelled Parker. Parker turned around to see Hadley, his friend, lying limp on the floor with a gash across her throat. Parker reached for Hadley, but her body went into another of those shadowy things and grabbed Parker's arm. It got up and threw Parker to the floor. He glanced at the shadowy thing, and more of them appeared. They reached for Parker, but he stood up and escaped. However, Parker was snatched by a black tendril. Parker noticed hundreds of eyes staring at him. He heard a variety of things, including horrors from his past, how his sister went insane, his house burned down, and he lost everyone. Parker realized who was doing this. It was him, the monster that stitched this smile in Parker, the one who claimed everyone had a breaking point, and the one who killed Hadley. Parker pushed himself free of the black tendril and turned around to run. He had to run. No, he had to take revenge. Parker spun around to face the massive eyes. There he saw a glint of gold, a golden pocket watch. Parker closed his eyes and inhaled before rushing into the mass of eyes. Parker took hold of the pocket watch. The black void receded, revealing the hospital and the one responsible, the armator. The armator stood with his arms crossed. It was undoubtedly the armator. His dark robe, gray bandages on his arms, and black expression-changing mask, all confirmed. His usual white smile turned into a somewhat annoyed frown. He then slyly smiled. Well, you're smarter than I thought," said the armator. Parker, angry, flung the pocket watch to the ground, smashing it. The armator stared at the broken pocket watch and realized what it meant. The arcanist could not create any more illusions. The armateurs used the golden pocket watch to maintain their illusions. If he wanted to make more, he'd have to find another valuable object. The armator took a step back, his expression shifting to a terrified yet slightly amused smile. The armator held his hands up and winked. "You kill me, you will never know peace," said the armator. "You won't get her back." Parker swung at the armator's face, cracking his mask. "Oh, I know," said Parker. "But your time ends here, bitch." The armator chuckled. "Oh well, I may have not broken you, and I guess my time's up. But I'll be back, you can't get rid of me." The armator fell to the floor, clearly pretending to be frightened. "You won't escape me," said the armator. "I'll always be there," that dark whisper. "My master will revive me." Parker raised his bat before saying, "Your time here is up." Parker swung his bat, shattering the armator's mask completely. The expressions on armator's mask disappeared. The armator tumbled to the ground. Parker let out a sigh of relief. Was it over? Parker wasn't sure. Parker got up and left. He knew what he needed to know. Now he had to figure out what to do next. Parker stared at his hands. What now? Meanwhile, in the hospital, the armator's limp body lay, with one of his arms reaching for the shattered pocket watch. Bedtime story. My mother always told me not to be afraid of the dark. Why shouldn't I be? Bad things happen in the dark. No matter how old I get, I will always be afraid of the dark. I was always like this. Want to know why I'm this way? It happened when I was 11. It was a cold and stormy night. I'm just starting off with this lame intro because it's all true. Lightning filled the sky with beautiful streaks of snow-white color. It was our first time in the new house. I lived with my mom and brother. My brother was 18. I'll skip to the point. I went up to my new bedroom after dinner. My mother came up to tuck me in. I have to mention that I have a breathing problem, and I need the window open to breathe better. She opened the window, and there was this huge tree full of leaves in front of it. Some of the rain got in, and my mom had to put a mat by the window. Leaves also flew in. The first night as I slept, a noise awakened me. Now, in your normal scary movies and situations, it takes time for something to happen. For me, it happened immediately. In front of my window sat someone with their hands on their knees singing a song. A lullaby, perhaps, in another language. The figure, boy or girl, I wasn't sure, sat there swaying side to side. "Can I tell you a bedtime story?" they said. It was a man's voice, cracky and so low I could barely hear him. I pulled my blanket close to me as I screamed for my mother. The lights came on suddenly, and the man's face, fast as a heartbeat, changed into an impossible frown. His mouth stretched down into a frown. He opened his mouth, and it started swaying side to side as he spoke. "If you're scared, we'll be there. It's all right, do not cry. Nothing will tear us apart. The best things happen in the dark," it said, sounding like a toy with a low battery. Just then, the door to my room drew really slowly. My brother's head poked through the door. Then it dropped to the ground. My mom's head was thrown across me. Then right there, standing in my doorway, was a creature or some demon so indescribable. I could barely move. The sight of it paralyzed me. The figure was pitch black, and it had a burnt body. The arms were raised in the air, and it walked inch by inch. The legs bounced up and down as it walked, and its eyes were red. It had horns sticking out of its cheeks, and where its mouth should have been was just an empty hole of space. I didn't care what the man with the frown would do to me. I just ran past him and out the window. There isn't much to that story. The police, of course, didn't believe me. No one did. I was almost charged for the murder of my mom and brother, but thank God I wasn't. I have a hard time sleeping, and I need pills for it. Every night before my eyes close, I swear I can see that mouth creature. and its red eyes staring at me. I know it's watching me sleep because at night I can hear the lullaby. The church on Rock Hill. I slammed my mug down onto the wooden table that stood in front of the bartender. Greatest damn beer ever. Give me another round, my good man. He nodded. The bar is hundreds of conversations told in loud voices, all of them competing with the rock music that dominates the atmosphere. The crowd is young, students from the university for the most part. Me, I'm just some 34-year-old passing through some dried-up town heading home. As my drink was being brought to me, some guy, pretty young, abruptly sat next to me. He was shivering, like crazy. His hands could barely grip his black leather jacket for him to take it off. I stared at the guy. You all right? He stared at me with wide, horrified blue eyes. It's coming for me. He whispered, staring straight into my eyes. The guy was insane, a loath. But I was bored, and I had until tomorrow night before the bus arrived, so I decided to let him entertain me. What do you want to talk about? I asked him, winking at the bartender to give him a drink. It's crazy, he stuttered. You'll think. I'm insane. Come on, I'm sure it's not that bad. Try me. I said it in the nicest way possible. He faced the floor as he spoke. I never believed in ghosts or spirits or anything. I'm an explorer of so-called haunted houses. I do my best to explain phenomenal occurrences. I've never come across anything like I did at Rock Hill. There's nothing like it, I swear. I should have listened. I should have believed. I should have turned back when I felt the chills down my spine, but I didn't listen to my warnings. I'm stuck here. I can't leave. It's going to get me. Sir. His head quickly turned to face me. My name is William. His eyes widened like I was supposed to know his name. William, I continued. What's Rock Hill? He looked at me, shocked. It's the hill right above us. There's a church up there, an abandoned one. Before you follow the trail to the hill, there is a sign. Well, there was a sign, but I broke it when I tried to escape. The sign said, "No trespassing whatever you do. You will regret it." He laid his hand on mine. The rumors are true. When you're halfway up the hill, the temperature drops. It gets really cold. Your breathing slows down like you're having an anxiety attack. There's a weird taste in your mouth that tastes like spoiled rotten meat. It's so bad it makes you puke. He showed me a disgusting stain on his shirt. I'm not making this up, man. That's not the worst part. You lose your trail afterward and time feels slower. The sky darkens, and even if you bring a flashlight with a full battery, I promise you, he whispered, it will turn off when you get to the church. I blinked at him a few times, holding in my smile. I was about to burst out laughing because his face was priceless. His lips trembled, and he kept looking around as if someone was coming for him. He was truly scary. Call me an asshole, but this guy was full of shit. I've been here for 7 days. I can't leave even if I try. It's after me. It's going to get me. It's so close, he said, standing up. Where are you going? I asked him. He just grabbed his jacket and ran out of the bar, not thanking me once for the beer. The next morning, I decided to hit the bar early. I didn't do much, just watch some sports. To be honest, I wanted that guy, William, to come back. I don't know why. I was going to offer him a bus ride with me tonight since he was stuck here. I smirked, thinking about the crazy story he told. I'm not much of a believer in ghosts or anything coming back to life after they've been dead. I got off one of the sofas and sat in front of the table. The bartender smiled at me. May I get you something? He asked in his gruff voice. I shook my head. What did you think of that guy's story? I asked him. To my surprise, he looked away. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Don't get yourself into trouble. If I were you, I'd leave this place as fast as I could. Listen to a warning when you hear one, boy. I looked at him, my mouth half open. My eyes shifted away and I smiled to myself. Don't tell me you believe in that. He just turned around and pretended to clean the same glass he was cleaning since I got there. Lazy cunt. I stood up, took a sip of my beer, and pulled up my pants. Well, I'm just going to have a look around this so-called Rock Hill then. That got the bartender's attention. He frowned, his eyes turned gray with anger, and he walked towards me, then grabbed my collar. "You think you're so smart, huh? I lost my son up there." He looked me right in the eyes as that thing took my boy. My wife stopped me because we had 4 other kids. She told me not to go up there. I listened. I waited for my son to come back all these years, hoping for a chance he survived. He never came back. Not once alive, not once dead. That guy you met the other night, William? He was only the lucky few to get out alive, and he's barely lucky. The church will get him one way or the other. I backed away from him and then spat. On the floor. "Go to hell," I said. The hills are little more than a layer of poor soil over rock. They are clothed in scrubby grass, too poor to even put flesh on a goat. In each depression is a small frozen puddle. And so for now, it is simpler to just walk your own path over the frost-stiffened grass. Sometimes the path will branch away right or left, and I have to check my compass. It would be easy to get lost. I have 5 hours of daylight left and no way of knowing how far away my destination is. All I have is the word that it takes 20 minutes to spot the church. I was only a few feet up the trail. I had to climb over a wooden fence to get up here. The fence was spiked with metal. This town seemed pretty serious about this church. I continued walking up the trail. To the side of me were very beautiful trees. The air smelled of honeysuckle and cold grass. This area would be great for photography, I thought. It's a shame to be boarded off. 10 minutes passed and nothing really changed. There was just more of an increase in trees. As I looked behind me, I could see a small bit of the town. So far so good, I thought. A few feet ahead of me, something stuck up in the grass. When I got closer, I saw a wooden sign that was knocked over. It was actually broken, and when I put it together, I was able to read it. On a part of the sign, there was even a smudge of blood. I put the sign down and laughed to myself. Maybe he did come up here after all, but he probably broke it on accident. I wasn't really trying to be paranoid about any of this and kept walking. About 5 more minutes passed. I rubbed my hands together, for it was getting a bit cold. A bit too cold, actually. My hand felt numb. I thought about William. It was one of the warnings. Another smile crossed my face. It was already cold. It just gets colder the higher you get. William was stupid. I stopped smiling and my stomach started to ache. I gagged 2 or 3 times but didn't puke. Startled, I stopped walking. What the hell was that about? My stomach felt weak, and my mouth felt dry. I didn't bring water like I should have, mostly, because there's this disgusting taste in my mouth. It tasted like raw fish. I was starting to get freaked out. As I stared more up the hill, I shook my head. I should head back. Seeing an abandoned church wasn't something I was really excited about anyways. I had come all this way just to turn around. The sky started to turn a dark blue color. That was weird. It should only be 2:45 p.m. When I looked at my watch, it had stopped on 2:34. Strange. I had only walked about 8 minutes and the sky was almost completely dark. So dark I had to use my phone flashlight. As I was going down the hill, I noticed the same beautiful trees I had seen before were nothing but pitch-black tall silhouettes standing still. They didn't even look real. They looked cartoonish or like those old trees in old horror movies that are pointy-looking. What the hell was going on? I felt sick, cold, and most of all annoyed. I should have never come up this hill because I had no clue where I was now. The town wasn't even in view. 2 minutes passed and the sky was completely gray with the moon shining as bright as ever. At least I didn't have to use my phone to see. However, behind some trees I heard a sound. It sounded like a person. I stopped and listened some more. It was a boy's voice. He sounded young. He was talking to someone. Well, at least, that's what it sounded like. I walked towards the trees, turning on my flashlight. The trees were dead and branchy now. Something wasn't right. I knew I was lost before, but this definitely wasn't the same path I had gone before. The closer I walked, the more I understood the words. "You can't escape," the boy's voice said. "Not even through death." The boy said this over and over as I inched my way closer and closer. What blocked the rest of my view was a fence covered in moss and cobwebs. The voice was behind the fence. I shone my phone light at the broken door, and then made my way through it. In front of me, standing high as ever, was the abandoned church. It was dark. Gnarled trees hung low over the baronial church, creaking ominously in the howling winds. The heavy oak doors broke open, echoing around the empty church. The moonlight shone through the heavily cracked stained glass windows, casting an eerie glow onto the dusty altar. Thick cobwebs hung on every surface, and his footsteps sounded deafening on the cold stone floor as he walked on it. There was no boy, no voice, and no one around. He shone his flashlight inside the church, which only exposed tattered red chairs in the front of the altar. He walked down the row of chairs. Broken wood and glass were everywhere. "What a wreck," he said. Suddenly, a light shone down onto the altar. The light wasn't coming from any source around me. It looked to be coming down from heaven. That's the best I could explain it. A bell rang so loudly I felt the vibrations shake my whole body. Startled, I ran back to the door, but as I did, I noticed it was gone. There was nothing but concrete. My heart raced, and my head started spinning. I couldn't fathom what was going on, mostly because I didn't want to accept the truth. But the truth couldn't hold off for just a few more seconds. Appearing, one by one, at a time, were kids, women, and men sitting in the chairs. Their expressions, still but at the same time scared. All of them sat, looking at the altar. I turned my head towards the altar, too. Silence. It was the kind of silence that falls right before you get knifed in the back. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my blood chill in my veins. In front of the altar stood an old man. He talked, but no sound whatsoever escaped from his mouth. He pounded on the altar, silently screaming words I couldn't hear. But they heard it. The people were squeezing their kids and crying. Some were even running towards the wall where the door was. But people dressed in black robes stopped them. Their faces weren't visible with the robes on. Blood started pouring from the old man's eyes, and people stood up immediately. Some clapped, and some more made their way towards the wall. No one seemed to see me as I stood completely still, but as soon as I moved, everyone faced me. A kid inched his way towards me, reaching out his hand. He placed his hand on my leg. We can't escape, not even through death. The man at the altar, like lightning, he was suddenly in front of me. The sound of a child screaming emerged behind me. At first it was distant, but it came steadily closer, and all the while becoming more intense, more distressed, until it was undeniably in the house itself. I ran towards the wall where the door was, pushing people out of the way. They fell down, like statues being knocked over. Then it changed abruptly. Maniacal laughter came in gusting bursts. The altar disappeared, replaced by a view of gallows on a star-freckled night. The lights winked out. Then from the gloom there stepped a ragged man, rubbing his hands together, his white lips pulled tight over broken teeth. Taking a step forward, he opened his crooked mouth to speak, but what came out was my own voice, high and fearful. "Your appeal is denied. You will hang on sunrise." Hands quickly reached out to me, hands of children, women, and men. The look in their eyes was horrifying. They wanted me. They wanted my soul. They wanted to escape, to leave this horrible place forever. I kicked, punched, and did everything I could to get away. My face stung from the scratches they left me. I ran forward, making my way towards the window that was behind the altar. I was so close, but I fell onto something. It was a pile of dirt, and rested on top was a rotted, skinless face with his mouth open. The screaming got louder, too loud for me to take. I ran out the window, not caring what lay behind the church. The last thing I remember was the moonlight, staring down at me, and the sharp pain. Everything was the same and different. The trees stood naked as they had before, but their twigs curled in a distorted way, as if the tree itself screamed in pain. The sky was a mass of gray cloud, again so ordinary for November. But instead of letting small shafts of light through, they emitted an ethereal glow. The wind was just as bitter as the day before, coming straight from the north. But the scent was something else, metallic almost, with a tinge of acrid burning. I struggled to pick up my phone, but my left arm wouldn't move. The dim moonlight only revealed a small bone sticking out from my joint. Blood spilled slowly. I started to cry. My legs were tangled in some twigs. My ankle burned and ached, with pain. I looked at my surroundings. I was on the side of the church. Before I could take in everything, I heard the screeching screams again of the people of the church. They called my name all together in an evil choir. I struggled to get up. Groaning in pain, I was able to stand, but barely. I limped out of the twigs and made my way past the fence and down the hill. As I walked, I wished to God that I could go deaf because I heard them. They were so close, calling out after me with anger, hatred, and sadness. All I could think about is dying. I was so afraid I'd die, and I felt that it was so near. But to be honest, I wasn't afraid of dying. I never was, but now I wonder, what if I die now, and I'm the one that never escapes? A dark and fast silhouette of something unknown to me slithered in front of me, heading my way. The big creature has black, papery-looking skin. It's so skinny it looks like he doesn't have any muscle at all. His dead, caved-in eyes are completely black, with small red pupils. What makes a chill go down my spine is that he has no mouth. I look back at it. It gets closer and closer until it is breathing down the back of my neck. Using all my strength in my right arm, I elbow it in the face. It makes a howling sound, then screeches at me before running into the trees. I started running. Through the pain, I ran and ached and ached. I bled and bled. I was so close to fainting, so close. Things were starting to get blurry. As I'm running nonstop, I see a person in front of me. I can't tell if it's a boy or a girl, but they're reaching their hand out at me. I woke up to the sound of whistling. I looked up and saw William. He stares at me and shakes his head. "You're so stupid." I look around, noticing we're in a room upstairs from the bar. His room. I did my best to sit up, but the pain stopped me. William patted my leg. "Please rest. I have to go up." "Your bus exploded," William said with no facial expression. "It was about to pull off, then it just exploded with 13 people inside. The next bus is in 2 days. Good luck trying to leave. Just like me, you're stuck here." He said. With that said, I got up. Pain or no pain, I was getting the fuck out of this town. Days passed. Every time I tried to leave, something either happened or something tried to stop me. I was in a cab today, and then something just came out of the woods and ran underneath the car, just like that. When we got out to check, nothing was there, nothing but a flat tire. I'm at the bar now, and the bartender is looking away from me. He doesn't make eye contact with me, not once. When I look at him, I know what he wants to say. They were right about everything. Tonight another us was coming, and I was convinced I'd leave. I have to. I was going to take William with me. As I walked upstairs to his room, I felt a chill go down my spine. Something was wrong. I just felt that. As I opened the door, I looked to see the creature that attacked me on the hill, carrying a lifeless William in his hands. It screeches, then heads out the window. There's a note on the bed, though. "You're next." The Dream Collector. In the small village of Eldridge, legends of the old Winters mansion had persisted for decades. Perched on the outside of the town, shrouded by deep forests that rarely saw sunlight, the estate had stood abandoned for decades. It was the focal point of numerous local stories, but none more tenacious than that of the Dream Collector. Our Sal, a teenager with a predilection for the unexplained, had grown up hearing these stories. The Dream Collector was claimed to be a shadowy entity that roamed the mansion at night, trapping the deepest nightmares of those who dared to sleep within its walls. These horrors, it was believed, were locked away in a secret chamber, never again to haunt the dreamers. Driven by a mixture of terror and interest, Arsal determined one clear fall night to seek the truth. He equipped himself with a torch, a notebook, and an ancient digital camera, gifts from his late grandfather who had been the town's unofficial historian. With a tense excitement simmering within him, Arsal headed out for the mansion just as the sun dropped below the horizon, creating deep shadows across the village. The gate to the mansion creaked ominously as he pushed it open, the old iron moaning under his touch. The path to the front door was overgrown. the previously groomed grass now wild and untamed. As he neared the huge front door, a shudder ran down his spine. Not from the cold, but from the impression of walking through a gateway into another realm. The door flung open with an eerie screech that echoed through the deserted halls. Inside, the mansion was a shadow of its former magnificence. Dust layers blanketed every surface, and cobwebs dangled like curtains. The air was dense with the musty stench of decay. Arsal's spotlight pierced the darkness, shining light on faded images of people who seemed to watch him with serious eyes. He strolled through the rooms on the ground floor, each step reverberating in the great nothingness. Nothing seemed out of the usual until he entered the library. It was even larger than he had thought, its shelves loaded with books and weird items. At the center of the room stood a massive desk, and behind it, a man enveloped in darkness. "You must be the dream collector," Arsal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned slowly, its face veiled beneath a hood. "Yes," it answered, its voice strong and resonant. "And you are bold to seek me out. Why have you come?" "I want to know why you collect nightmares and what you do with them," Arsal responded, attempting to sound bolder than he felt. "The dream." Collector raised its hood, revealing a face that was neither old nor young, its features keen and ethereal. "I collect them because nightmares are powerful. They are born from the innermost fears of humans, fears that might emerge and wreak devastation if left unchecked. I lock them here, in the Chamber of Echoes, where they can no longer harm anyone." Arsal's curiosity deepened. "Can you show me this chamber?" The dream collector paused, examining him for a long period. "Very well, but be advised, the things you see can haunt you." He guided Arsal through a hidden entrance behind the bookshelves, down a tiny winding stairway that dropped deep into the earth. The air grew colder as they proceeded, and the walls seemed to shut in around them. Finally, they entered a big vaulted hall, its walls lined with numerous drawers. "Each drawer contains a nightmare," the dream collector continued, ripping one open to reveal a swirling mass of shadows. "They are kept here, contained and controlled." Arsal watched, fascinated and scared, as the shadows seemed to stretch towards him, only to be snatched back as the drawer was closed. "Have you ever released a nightmare?" he inquired. "Only once," the collector said, a hint of remorse in his voice. "And it created enormous sorrow. That is why I must ensure they remain locked away forever." Moved by the collector's burden, Arsal inquired, "Can I help? Is there a method to make sure they never escape?" The dream collector gazed at him, a spark of surprise in his eyes. "Perhaps, but it would need you to take up a part of this load. Are you willing?" Arsal thought of his village, his friends, and his family. He thought of the horrors he had had, and the relief he felt when he woke up unharmed. "Yes," he said. "I'm willing." "Very well," the collector said. He taught Arsal how to contain and manage the nightmares, passing on part of his ancient wisdom and his powers. As the first light of dawn came into the chamber, Arsal sensed a change within himself. He was no longer just a youngster from Eldridge. He was a protector of serenity, a keeper of the night's greatest fears. He left the mansion that morning with a sense of purpose he had never had before. The village of Eldridge would sleep a little sounder, all due to the new dream collector. Sweetbread, an epilogue. My sister has always had a soft heart, soft as sweetbread. She cried after the old woman despite everything, maybe because of everything. I remember holding her as she wept, both of us covered in soot, her fingers scalded from holding shut the oven door. After the tears, she was quiet. She trailed me through the awful house with its sweetbread walls and sugared windows. I found the clothes we'd arrived in, offered up her kirtle, and she donned it without a word. She showed no whisper of response. When we found the treasure in the attic, only nodded vaguely when I asked her to help me fill up the few bags we could easily carry back through the woods. Maybe it would be enough to keep us safe from our stepmother's whims. I do not want to go back there. It was the first she'd spoken in hours. I hesitated outside the witch's cottage, looking back over my shoulder at her. I do not want to go back to them, I sighed. Nor do I, but where else can we go? She wrung her fingers together in front of her skirt, eyes downcast and her teeth digging into her lower lip. Eventually, though, she nodded. Fine, you are right. She looked back at the house. Wait 1 minute, there may be something left in the kitchen. The kitchen? I repeated in horror, but she only nodded. Yes, she did not think I paid attention, but I did. I know which of her potions might be useful. If nothing else, we can sell them when we get back. I nodded slowly and followed her back into the cottage, though I stopped in the open arch that led into the kitchen itself. She moved easily through the space, reminding me painfully of just how long she had been under the witch's thumb while the horrid crone tried to fatten me like a prize hog. She collected some dozen bottles and vials, tucking them carefully in between the bolts of silks and satins we had pilfered from the attic before returning to me. Let us go. Though there was no trail this time, she seemed to know her way through the trees. I asked how, once, when we paused to wait out the dark, but all she said was that she simply knew now, as though the forest spoke to her in a way it hadn't before. I felt the first thrill of fear at that, but I knew that she was still so scared herself. I refused to let her see it. I tried to coax her into dreaming about what sort of life we might have with the witch's pilfered treasure, and managed to earn a wan smile for my efforts. But it was cold and dark, and soon enough we simply huddled together under a gnarled tree as we waited for the deepest part of night to pass. When grayish dawnlight began to filter through the leaves, she was the first to stand. She had gone quiet again, and only answered me with faint hums or single words as we continued on our way. She seemed more comfortable to be leading us now, but something in the set of her shoulders reminded me of something I could not quite name. Eventually I lapsed into her silence. When the trees broke apart to reveal the familiar shape of our father's home, she froze. Then she broke into a run, and I was only half a step behind her. The door was already opening when we reached the stoop, and our father met us with his arms open and tears in his eyes. He held us close and apologized over and over, praising the Lord's name. I embraced him in turn, but alongside the relief in my chest, there was an anger in my gut. It had started a spark, but over the length of our trek back through the woods had grown into a steady flame. I met my sister's eyes over our father's shoulder, and a chill ran through me. If my anger was a flame, then hers was the dead, cold of darkest winter. Our father explained that our stepmother had been stricken ill not long after we left. She was in her room now, asleep, and had been for days. He did not expect her to recover, though he had been following the physician's orders as best he could. Perhaps she shall rally to see you, he offered us hopefully. When neither of us answered, he sighed and dragged a hand down his thick beard. There was more gray in it than I remembered. I know you must be angry with me, with us, he told us wretchedly. That I could lose track of you so easily. It is an unforgivable failing in a father. Lost? I started slightly, at the sharp edge in my sister's voice. Our father did too. She had always had a soft voice to match her heart. We were lost? She repeated, staring at him intently. Our father stared back, eyes wide with a hint of fear. Lost, he confirmed at last in little more than a whisper. I dropped my eyes, unable to continue looking at him. My sister did not. My sister knelt beside the hateful woman and smoothed a hand over her brow in a gesture so tender, it made me want to break something. Here. She tipped one of the witch's vials against her lips. This will help. I almost reached out to stop her, but as though she sensed the movement, she held a staying hand back toward me. When the vial was empty, she stood and brushed her hands down the front of her skirt. She did not look at me as she left the room. I hesitated a moment longer behind her, staring at the woman who had left us to the wood and the wild. Already her breathing seemed easier. Anger and love for my sister warred, twin flames in the center of my chest. She had always borne such a soft heart, Our stepmother was awake and lively within a day. Though shocked by our return, she was mollified enough by the offerings of treasure we had stolen away with, that she simpered, and even summoned up some mawkish tears through which to tell us she was so sorry we had been lost to the wood. My rage burned hotter, and my sister grew colder. "We should celebrate your return," our stepmother exclaimed, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders but no other sign of her illness remaining. "What do you wish for supper, my darlings?" "Sweetbread." I jerked around to stare at my sister, eyes wide and mouth agape. She did not so much as glance at me, but I felt her hand take mine under the table. She smiled at our stepmother, and my throat went dry. "But you are still recovering, stepmother." "I feel quite well, all things considered. I shall make it," she offered gently. I could have stopped her then, could have clutched her hand in mine and dragged us out. We could have taken the treasure and left. It had been foolish of me to think there was nowhere for us to go. We might go anywhere. Seeing our father again, hearing him refuse to admit what they had done, made me sure of that. But my sister looked at me just for a moment, and the ice in her gaze froze me to my chair. She was not looking for permission, but I nodded shakily anyway. Our stepmother exclaimed what a good, kind girl she was as she moved into the kitchen. Soon enough, the cloying smell of the baking sweetbread hung thick in the air. It was all I could do not to gag. My sister served the plates while the bread was still steaming gently, even drizzling the last of our honey stores over our parents' portions. "We can always get more at the market now," she said with a hollow little laugh. Our stepmother agreed happily, though our father hesitated a moment before doing so himself. He was watching my sister with a faint wariness as she took her seat beside me. "Go on then, let us eat." They did. We sat in silence. It took our stepmother first. A faint cough, a furrow in her brow. She looked up with confusion, which changed quickly to a horrified realization as she stared at my sister. "You..." Our father choked, red spattering his lips. I looked away, squeezing my sister's hand tight where she had once more taken it beneath the table. We were desperate," he strangled out, reaching for her pleadingly. "I did not want to, she made me." My sister shook her head. "You let her." He collapsed forward onto the table, his breath a wheezing rattle that grew fainter with each passing moment. Our stepmother tried to lunge for us, but her legs gave out and she sprawled across the floor. A scarlet trail, like candied jam, trickled from the corner of her mouth. "You..." She gasped again, glaring balefully up at my sister. "You... little witch." They both began to convulse. I buried my face in my sister's shoulder. I could feel her stroking my hair. Even without raising my head, I knew she did not look away, until their last breaths had faded into silence. Then she simply stood, her hand still in mine. We were both silent as we gathered up our bags, still, unpacked by the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening. "You are afraid," I swallowed. Yes." She smiled at me, squeezed my hand again, and all I felt was cold. "You do not need to be. I will protect you. My sister has always had a soft heart, soft as poisoned sweetbread." Venus buried. The girl in the graveyard is your best friend, so you take her home. The night is a bruise between you, a blotch of rogue in the passenger window, the color of fruit left out to fester. The body pries at her seatbelt, a finger, then two. The radio echoes static. The body shuffles in her seat. You study the face, the similar slice of jaw, the nose humped from where a baseball had hit her at 12, just slightly off-center. The skin like a rain-licked plastic bag, the stink of musk and sulfur. You want to look away, but you cannot. She's so beautiful, even like this. Your headlights rake warbled slits through the dirt road, a yellow like jaundice. Your hands are stiff from the cold, your lips cracked. The girl beside you is dead, and you are bringing her home. 4 days ago, you'd stepped into a hardware store and emerged with a shovel sturdy enough to lift a life on. 4 days you'd spent digging, dirt in your own backyard until loam muddied under your fingernails and erratic holes split garden beds. like the mouths of greedy beasts, until you could sift through soil with your eyes closed, with a hand bound. 4 nights you had lain in your bed, staring at the pockmarked ceiling, wondering what it felt like to burn alive. Now the shovel beats dull against the skin of your trunk, your hands gripping the steering wheel like a throat you're trying to silence. The body turns, dawn bleaching the salmon gray of her skin. The left eye slips from its socket, and she pushes it back in with the heel of her hand. She smiles, head lolling like a marionette's. "Sorry, baby." Her voice comes out strained. "I wasn't expecting company, I'm sure you understand." In a sickle of citrus moonlight, Adeline Marcus smiles up at you with shell-pale gums. Adeline Marcus died on the 31st of October and was buried a week later. The date on her gravestone a month shy of her 18th birthday. In the court, the boys would claim it was an accident, that they didn't know she was inside. For better or worse, you believe them. The fingers striking out matchboxes, the beer cans constellating the sidewalk. A prank gone too far, the wrong place, the wrong time. It doesn't have to be on purpose. She didn't have to be home. The coroner ruled it suffocation, but all you can imagine is flame like a stiff palm, striking over and over. Adeline had crawled from the mouth of the home on her hands and knees. She was dead by the time she reached the pavement, her Sunday dress singed up to her knees. The dress you knew well enough. Either way, the boys were left with 25 to life, and the Marcuses were left with a dead daughter, a ring of ash-like chalk on the pavement. You were left with a misplaced guilt like hunger, a guilt like an Ouroboros. Choking on the tail, swallowing the head, eating yourself alive and being unable to stop, even as it consumes you. Because this wasn't the sort of thing that happened to good people. You watch water curl down your shower drain carrying with mortuary makeup, kaleidoscopic insects, and jasmine bubbles, strings of dirt stretched out like sinew. The body's head rests on her knees, vertebrae needling through her back like a line of molars. The electric lights wash her green, dark veins rooted under brittle skin. She turns her face to the shower head and picks at the powdery sediment under her fingernails. The shower floor is a mess of grit, and you think of a child scooping up the sand. You turn the heat up until it scalds and scrub mildew from the base of the shower door. You think, if you can only get everything clean, everything will be all right. She turns her head and looks at you through eyes obscured by glass paneling. She says, "It's not as bad as all that. I don't even think I felt a thing." But she says, it through lips the color of spoiled plums, so the sentiment doesn't ring true. You lift threadbare towels from the bottoms of your linen closet. You walk 3 times around your block and return to a corpse sat on your sofa like she has nowhere. Better to be. There are ants in your sugar bowl. You try to remove them, lifting their crystal-knotted bodies on the prong of a fork, but they slip between the gaps, and you are left with a mess bigger than when you started. Tea-brown sludge bleeding from thoraxes and the stink of vinegar. There's a dead girl on your sofa, but let's focus on the ants in your sugar bowl. The way they thread through cysts of white like veins on a leaf, like the capillaries that run through the skin of your face. You make tea anyway. You add too much milk and sit cross-legged in front of the body. She stares at you. You stare back. The two of you drink, and ribbons of watery milk pour clean out her trachea, the gaping hole in her chest. But she doesn't stop drinking until... "You do. You're not looking at me," she says. "Not really." "Yes, I am." You twist your hands in the shag carpet. "Aren't I now?" "No," she says. "You're not." You leave your teacup on the floor, saucer and iris of yellow, and go upstairs. You take 2 cigarettes from the carton squashed on your father's desk, and then think better of it, pressing down with your heel until tobacco dissipates into the tawny carpet. You change your bed sheets twice, eggshell white, no, gray with peonies. You make a 2nd cup of tea. When you get back to the room, the body is still there. You are looking at her. You are not looking at her. "Do I disgust you?" she says. "No," she shakes her head, dark hair plastered to her shoulders like reeds. "No more than I always did." "You need to sleep," you say. "Baby," she tilts her head to one side. "Sleeping is all I've ever done. The last time you saw Adeline Marcus alive was in the back of a stranger's car. parked on a stranger's street, with the taste of a stranger's tequila fresh between your lips. You were never too built for parties, so the outcome was a pair of girls who looked like they were playing dress-up. Blousy dresses with sleeves like a nun's, thrift store necklaces noosing your necks, shoplifted lipstick which she hid beneath, her mattress more wax than pigment. But in the citrus peel of streetlights, in the low trill of distant music, the two of you looked beautiful. She had her legs curled under her and was sitting sideways in the back seat, her hand resting on your knee, and the other palmed against the window, a song on her lips that you couldn't quite place. You were too close, but it was night, and everyone was inside and drunk, and sometimes we all need to feel closer than we should be, to lose ourselves a little. The song melted on her lips, swallowed into the limp press of salvia and booze, and you said something like, "I think I should go home now," and she said something like, "Have another drink." And so you did. You let her pour the liquor into the flimsy mouths of red plastic cups and watched her swallow. She said, "You're so pretty." And you said, "I think you should stop." And she said, "Just let me say that one thing." And you wanted to say, "Stop fucking looking at me like that." And you wanted to say, "I want to crawl inside you and make a life for myself in the city of your mind." And you wanted to say, "Let's just be quiet. Let's just not talk. Let's just not ruin a good thing by telling the truth." Instead, you pushed open the passenger door and stumbled out onto the skin of vein blue sidewalk. "I'm going home now." The body lays with her back to your bed, hands worming in the floral sheets, chestnut hair spilling across her throat, past the ballpoint, pen-marked bedposts over the gray skin of her forehead. You are thinking about the silken mouth of a coffin. You are thinking of how she looked when you pulled her from the rose mouth of heaven. The radiator hums. A lace curtain billows in your open window. She rolls over onto her side, slots her hands together like pieces of a decaying jigsaw puzzle. You still can't even look at me. Her mouth moves too slowly, words like chewing gum. "Why am I here, Bet? What's it for? There are pink crescent moons on the bed of your palms from the bite of your nails." She pulls her knees to her chest, and a bone cracks. She pulls her knees to her chest, and a molar tumbles from between her keyhole lips. "You can only love me when I'm not here. You can only love me when there's nothing left to love." You press your cheek to the cool spread of linen beside her. You listen to the steady beat of your heart, the way you can feel it in your fingertips, entirely singular. "Don't tell anyone." You say, "Did you want it to die with me, Bet?" She shifts, and her hair falls against the nape of your neck. "Were you glad it was silenced?" "Don't tell anyone." You say again. She sighs, lays herself back down so you're face to face. Crooked nose, eye pulling from its socket, the onset of gray-green decay wreathing her jaw. The smell of soil and rot and cicada-heavy nighttime. "Who could I tell?" She brushes your hand. "I'm not really here." And suddenly, you can imagine it is your fist splitting beer cans in two like overripe fruit. It is your fingers on the matchbox, your fingers striking out. But you both know the house would still be on fire, and you both know you'd leave alone. You take her hand. You put your face in the crook of her neck and beg forgiveness from a ghost. Drone. She first heard it while she was making coffee. The morning was already off to a rough start. Rachel had woken up, lazy and languid in the wake of her twice-snoozed alarm, and reached for her husband's side of the bed. Much to her disgruntlement, the spot where he should have been was empty and cold. She glared at the empty space for a moment, then promptly snoozed her alarm again out of spite. One of the downsides of working from home was she missed out on good morning kisses as Mark got ready for his morning commute. The upside, however, was she could take a few extra minutes to pout about it. Once her alarm declared her brooding time over, Rachel sighed, put the alarm to rest for good, and pulled herself out of bed. She immediately had the urge to crawl back into it. The air beyond her cozy covers was chilly with mid-October's refusal to turn on the heater until absolutely necessary. Mark. Even worse, as soon as she was upright, she was reminded of every little discomfort that came with having an adult human body. Back pain, ankle pain, jaw pain from sleeping strangely, and a bonus ache in her joints from the cold. Oh, and after a few moments upright, she also needed to pee. All the usuals, checked off. After a brief stop by the bathroom, Rachel shambled her way into the kitchen like the zombie she sometimes suspected herself to be. Undead or not, she still had bills to pay, meaning she needed to be alert enough to do her job. A strong, hot cup of coffee was in order. She made her way to the coffee machine and fell into a familiar routine, seeking her prize almost on muscle memory. She got a mug from the cabinet. She set it beneath the machine's dispenser. She opened the machine's lid. Something began to buzz. She reached into the cabinet again. She retrieved an off-brand K-cup. The buzzing grew louder. She put the cup in the coffee maker. She closed the lid. The crunch felt violent. She selected 8 ahs on the little touchscreen. The buzzing became a drone. She pressed the button beneath the touchscreen. The machine began to whir. She could barely hear it over the droning. The floor creaked behind her. Something was watching her. Something was watching her. The world snapped back into uncomfortable clarity as she whirled around, nearly knocking a jar of sugar to the floor in the process. There was nothing behind her, of course. She was alone in her apartment. Mark had left for work before she'd woken up, and a quick glance to the right confirmed the door had been locked behind him. He even remembered to lock the deadbolt that morning. No one was there, the only sounds to be heard being the coffee maker steaming and the pounding of Rachel's heartbeat. No buzz, no drone. Rachel took a deep breath, then leaned back against the counter with a groan. Shaking off the adrenaline, she opened the fridge to grab some creamer and poured a generous amount into her cup. As she stirred her coffee, she reached for the pill container next to the kitchen sink. What better way to christen a fresh cup of coffee than by using it to wash down an unassuming little capsule? Not that she needed the coffee anymore. After whatever the hell that was, she was plenty awake. Coffee in hand regardless, she crossed the apartment to settle into her office and get to work. Over 6 months in, and her job still felt too good to be true. She'd managed to land a remote biller position for a telehealth practice. Medical billing was a notorious nightmare of paperwork, but that made it perfect for Rachel. Translating, rejection errors, filling in boxes, deciphering ERAs. That scratched a mental itch she hadn't realized she had. And the best part? Through the whole process, she hardly had to speak to a single soul. She could put on some music, bury her head in paperwork, and not worry about the world beyond her office for hours. Speaking of paperwork, signing into the practice's EHR revealed several bright red claim rejections waiting to be reviewed. They were all from the same insurance company and all related to the same clinician. So Rachel's first guess was an NPI-related issue. That puzzle led her to another, and soon enough, she found herself easing into the natural flow of work. She deciphered the error message. She emailed the clinician. She opened the next batch of rejections. She ignored the drone. She turned up her music. She pulled up a patient profile. She selected the billable dates of service. The droning overpowered her music. She double-checked the payer address. She finished the intimidating red form. Her jaw still ached. She submitted the claim. It was so loud. She opened another ERA. The drone was right behind her. It was in her lungs. She couldn't breathe. Her monitor suddenly shut off. She stared into her reflection. Something else stared back. Rachel pushed herself away from the desk with a gasp, nearly knocking over her chair in the process. She shivered and blinked at her computer screen, still on, lit with the awkward tables and blocks of text of insurance paperwork. She turned, her head to look to the left of the screen, at her office window. The glare from the still rising sun provided her a decent view of her reflection, normal and familiar. It hadn't been real. Rachel was safe, alone. Still, she turned around and double-checked that her office door was closed before she slid her chair back into place, just to be safe. Just for her own foolish reassurance. The workday continued. She got back into a rhythm, forcing herself to focus even when she started to hear that drone again. It wasn't real after all. It was just a trick, her brain playing games with her, in retaliation for too little rest. Lunch rolled around at noon like usual, but the memory of that morning made Rachel hesitate. She had to leave her office to get her lunch from the fridge. Why did that make her nervous? Even if the drone came back while she was in the kitchen, it couldn't hurt her. It wasn't real. She gave the coffee machine a wide berth anyway, taking the long way around the kitchen island to get to the fridge and scolding herself for being stupid the entire time, and for apparently leaving the creamer sitting out, she realized. God, what was with her that morning? Why was she having such a strange day? She shook her head at herself, then set the likely spoiled creamer by the sink to dump out later. She would deal with that mess after she had tucked into some leftover pasta. She opened the fridge. She picked up a plastic container. She opened the lid. Her hands were so cold. She put the container in the microwave. She pressed the one button. Her hands were shaking. The microwave turned on. The hum sounded off. The container began to spin. The hum wasn't coming from the microwave. Rachel turned around. The drone was in the office. The container kept spinning. The drone came closer to the door. Rachel was in danger. She could feel the droning in her bones. She couldn't move. There was nowhere to run. The microwave beeped, and Rachel yelped, jumping in place and tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She started shaking, wrapping her arms around herself. There was nothing to be afraid of, and yet for some bizarre reason, Rachel felt as if she was being hunted by something. What exactly she couldn't articulate, which just made her fear more frustratingly irrational. She was a grown woman. Couldn't she handle a few weird sounds scattered across her day? Briefly, she considered texting Mark. He could stay on the phone with her while he was at work. He'd done it before. If she really needed him to, she was. Sure, he'd come home. But what was she meant to say? There was a strange noise following her around the apartment, making her feel like she was going to die. That was absurd. If she texted Mark that, he'd come home, sure. He'd come home with a cop to take her to a mental hospital. Rachel grabbed her food from the microwave and left it on the counter to cool. She wasn't hungry anymore. She'd just throw it away later after work. Missing lunch once wouldn't kill her, right? She felt like she'd been asking herself a lot of questions like that the past few hours, avoiding the question she didn't want to answer. The question idled in the back of her mind as she went back to her office. It let her sit back down and start to settle at her desk again, then slowly crept up on her, in time to the rise of an unsettling, familiar sound. What was making that noise? It was nothing. Rachel knew that. The drone that was drifting up from her doorway again wasn't real, which meant nothing was making it. That nothing sure was loud, though, for something that didn't exist. The more Rachel let herself focus on it, the more she started to notice. It was hard to hear anything beyond the droning, but if she really focused, she could have sworn she heard the whisper of feet on carpet as it came closer. The drone was giving her a headache. She focused on it anyway. The drone came closer. She could hear the whisper of feet on carpet. It came closer still. It radiated cold. It was standing right behind her. She could feel its shadow over her. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was. Rachel screamed, swinging into open air, as she turned to push away whatever that thing behind her was. Much to her tearful frustration, it was gone again, the mind-numbing drone having retreated to the living room. It was in the living room. There was something there, something dangerous. It was toying with her, like a hunter that knew its prey was cornered. And now that she'd acknowledged it, it was bound to go in for the kill. Well, Rachel wasn't going to just let it have her. She forced herself up on shaking legs, stumbling to the office door and pushing it closed. She turned the lock, for all the good that would do, and started to back away. Just as she did, the drone suddenly rose to a crescendo, and a heavy weight slammed against the hollow wood door. Rachel startled, stumbling back, until she found herself in the corner of her office with nowhere else to go. The thing slammed against the door again. Rachel sank to the floor. The drone was furious. The door couldn't hold forever. Rachel hugged her knees and sobbed. The door shook with its rage. Rachel closed her eyes. She hoped Mark would be okay without her. The office door started to splinter. The front door opened. "Rachel!" The monster stopped throwing itself at the door and Rachel's head jerked up. That was Mark's voice. Oh God, no. "Mark, don't come inside!" Rachel yelled. "Leave! Lock the door behind you. Don't let it get to you." "Rachel, what are you talking about?" Mark called back, paying her warnings no mind. To Rachel's horror, the drone moved away from the office and back toward the kitchen, where her unsuspecting husband was. She started to choke on her sobs as grief and panic clashed in her throat. It was going to get Mark too. The monster was going to kill him, and then it was going to come back to the office and finish what it started with her. How long would it take for someone to notice they were dead? Would her co-workers worry after a few days of silence? Would her neighbors notice Mark's car never left? Would her parents call for a welfare check when she stopped answering their texts? "Oh, honey. Hey, it's okay, you're okay, can you open your eyes for me, please?" Slowly disbelieving, Rachel opened her eyes. She lifted her head to find Mark kneeling in front of her. He was completely fine, the office door wide open and the apartment quiet aside from her confused sobs. How? Did the monster escape out the front door? Did Mark kill it? "Can I hold you, sweetheart?" Mark asked, settling on the floor in front of her. Rachel nodded and Mark gently coaxed her forward into his lap. "There we go," he said gently. "It's okay. I've got you. It's okay. You're safe. You're safe." Rachel wrapped her arms around him, still shaking as she hid, her face in his shoulder. "Did you see it?" she asked him. "Did you see where it went?" "Mark, I thought it was going to kill me. I almost died." "Baby," Mark replied, "I don't know if there was a monster. Do you think you might have been hallucinating?" "What?" Rachel felt her thoughts stutter to a halt. "Hallucinating? But the psychiatrist lowered the dose of your ziprasidone a couple of weeks ago, remember? And she warned us that your brain might react badly to it," Mark reminded her. "She said it might even trigger an episode, so we needed to be watching for it. Do you think that could be what happened? That you could have been hallucinating because your brain's not adjusting well to the lower dosage?" Suddenly, just like that, the previous several hours of panic felt embarrassingly unnecessary. The last of Rachel's panic dissolved in an instant, replaced by hot shame that warmed her face and neck. "Oh my God," she mumbled into Mark's shirt. "I was totally hallucinating, wasn't I?" She felt Mark's shoulders loosen under her head in relief. "Yeah, Rach, I think so," he said, bringing a hand up to play with her hair. "But it's okay. It's nothing to be ashamed of, remember? Schizophrenia is an irregular bitch. We couldn't have known for sure if it was going to be okay with you taking less medication, which is why we didn't go cold turkey, right? Now we know. We'll get you back on your regular dose first thing tomorrow morning. Take a few days off work to make sure you're adjusting all right, and we'll tell the psychiatrist it didn't work out. It's okay. You're fine." Rachel took deep breaths as he spoke, letting his words sink in. His reassurances didn't chase all the embarrassment away, but they did help. At the very least, she knew that Mark wasn't upset. "God, I hope. The neighbors weren't home," she said after a moment, lifting her head. "I think I was screaming. I really thought something was there, Mark. God, I haven't had an episode like that in years." "Yeah, that sounds like it sucked ass," Mark agreed, leaning back on one hand. "How about this? You clock out early, take the next few days off, and tell your boss you aren't feeling well. Then you'll sit on the couch while I make a big pot of chili with extra diced tomatoes, and we spend the rest of the day watching terrible reality TV and bastardizing the ideal chili to Fritos ratio. Sound good?" Rachel met Mark's eyes for a moment, considering, then leaned up and kissed him. "I love you," she said simply. Mark chuckled and responded, "I'll take that as a yes." 10 minutes to email her boss and a few more kisses found Rachel settled on the couch as promised, wrapped up in the fluffiest blanket she and Mark owned. A British chef was yelling on the television, and Mark was bustling around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets while the ground beef browned on the stove. For the first time since she'd woken up, Rachel felt truly grounded and calm. "Hey, Rach, do you know where our can opener is?" Mark called from his spot by the stove. "Check the sink," Rachel called back. Dishes clattered together for a moment before Mark cheered softly, "Success," and turned on the faucet to wash the can opener. "By the way," he asked, "why's our creamer sitting next to the sink?" "Oh, that was my bad," Rachel apologized. "I accidentally left it out this morning. Man, that's another thing that should have tipped me off. I've been having disorganized symptoms for days." "Didn't catch them either," Mark pointed out. "And out of the two of us, I'm the one more likely to notice something's up. Don't beat yourself up about it, okay?" Okay, Rachel chuckled, rolling her eyes. Mark was starting to go a little overboard with his effort to keep her from feeling bad, but it was sweet how much he cared. It was also just nice, not to be judged. She wished more people's partners could be like Mark. The conversation gave way to comfortable silence. Something began to buzz in the office. The buzz slowly built into a drone. Rachel sighed. Acknowledging that the droning monster was a hallucination, evidently hadn't sent it away. She took a deep breath, focused on the TV, and ignored it. Thankfully, the droning faded on its own, but it would probably be good to keep track of her recurring hallucinations until she was steady. That in mind, Rachel looked toward the kitchen to tell Mark that she was hearing things again, only to notice he wasn't facing the stove. He wasn't looking at her either. He was looking toward the office. Rachel's blood ran cold. Time seemed to slow down as Mark finally looked at her and asked the one thing she wished he wouldn't. "Did you hear that?" Discarded skins. I remember finding the first one in my closet. I was grabbing a shirt, already late for work, when my hand brushed against it. Warm, rubbery, and yielding in a way that made my stomach churn. I yanked my hand back and stared at the thing draped across the hangers, a limp, hollow version of me sagging, the husk of discarded scrap. Its face, my face, stared back, lips parted in a silent plea. The eyes were empty, gelatinous voids. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. What the hell? My first thought was a prank. Maybe someone had broken in, made a grotesque model of me, and left it here. But no one had keys except me, and the precision was unnerving. The scar on my chin from a childhood fall, the crescent moon birthmark, under my collarbone, it was all there, rendered in grotesque detail. I grabbed it by the shoulder and shook it loose. The whole thing collapsed into a heap on the floor, as weightless as air, but uncomfortably warm to the touch. The closet smelled faintly of salt and decay. I shoved it into a trash bag and tossed it in the dumpster before driving to work. The image of its slack jaw burned into my memory. By noon, I'd convinced myself it was some sort of vivid hallucination brought on by stress, too much caffeine, too little sleep. But then another appeared. This one turned up under my bed. I was searching for my phone charger, and there it was, sprawled in the shadows as if it had been waiting. The hollow replica of myself, limp and sagging, carried a new, unsettling alteration. The left hand was missing 2 fingers. When I examined my own hand, my stomach lurched. My pinky and ring finger felt cold, numb, almost alien. I spent the rest of the night awake, pacing. The discarded skins weren't hallucinations. By the end of the week, I'd found 4 more. One in the passenger seat of my car, another hanging from the shower rod, dripping as if freshly peeled. Each time they became less complete. The one on the couch had a gaping hole where the stomach should have been. The one in the garage, its legs ended in frayed, uneven stumps. The air around them carried a faint static charge, buzzing against my skin. Each discovery left me more hollow, more off. My reflection in the mirror didn't feel right anymore. My movements lagged, mimicking a glitching video feed. And then, there was the itching, deep beneath the skin, under muscles along my spine. At night, I lay rigid in bed, clutching the sheets as my body writhed with an electric discomfort I couldn't scratch away. It came to a head when I decided to burn one. The 5th skin had appeared in my kitchen, slumped in front of the fridge, as though it had crawled there to die. I dragged it into the backyard, my hands shaking. the trash bag hissing against the grass. The lighter fluid splashed across its surface, glistening with an oily sheen. I lit a match, my breath hitching as the flame licked the edge. The smell hit me first, a sharp, acrid reek that turned my stomach. Then came the pain. It began in my fingers and tore through my nerves, jagged and relentless as barbed wire. I dropped the match and crumpled to my knees, screaming. A creeping pressure surged beneath my skin, straining it to the point of tearing. The fire hissed and died, the skin untouched. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along my own arm, and that's when I felt it. A seam, almost invisible, running along my wrist. I tugged at it instinctively and a sliver of my own skin peeled back. Beneath it I saw something. Not muscle, not bone. A gleaming dark mass rippling with a life of its own by morning. The itching became a torment. My flesh crawled with a million tiny unseen legs, gnawing from the inside out. I refused to look in the mirror. The reflection had grown wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Bloated, pale, stretched over bones that no longer seemed mine. My skin hung loose and clammy, as if it had been boiled and left to cool. The newest discarded skin sprawled across my bed, twisted and lifeless. A corpse dissected and abandoned. Its lips twisted into a leer that mocked every natural expression I'd ever made. Teeth crooked and too large for its face. The jaw sagged open, dripping a viscous fluid onto my sheets. The stench acrid and metallic. Its hollow sockets bored into me, accusing, demanding. I couldn't bear it. Something inside snapped. I slammed the door, dragged the blinds down until the room was a darkened tomb and staggered to the kitchen. My hands found the knife before my mind caught up. The cold steel trembled in my grip as I returned to the mirror, heart hammering. The reflection stared back and I almost didn't recognize it. The eyes were sunken pits. My lips, cracked and scabbed, quivered against yellowed teeth. My skin, gray, translucent and slick with sweat, clung to my frame, taut and unnatural, as if it might split at any moment. My fingers shook as I dragged the blade to the seam on my forearm, the line that had appeared days ago, mocking me with its symmetry. I pressed and sliced. Pain erupted, white-hot and electric, but it wasn't what I expected. The sensation burrowed, deep, raw, and satisfying, scratching an itch buried beneath the skin. The blade slid through the flesh, parting it in a jagged, bloodless line. The skin didn't bleed. It peeled, curling back in thick, mucus-slick layers that made my stomach churn. Beneath it, something pulsed, a living, glistening black mass. The surface shimmered as if oiled, twitching in time with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. It smelled of iron and something sharper, something alive. Breathing heavily, I dug my fingers under the edges of the peeling flesh and pulled. The old skin came away in long, rubbery sheets, each strip making a wet slap as it hit the floor. My jaw clenched against the growing agony, but I couldn't stop. My muscles burned, my vision swam, but I ripped and tore until the ground was littered with fragments of my former self. When I straightened, the thing in the mirror took my breath away. It stood tall, its surface an obsidian ripple of sleek muscle and unearthly symmetry. Tendrils of faint light coursed beneath its surface, illuminating veins that pulsed with a rhythm that felt powerful, infinite. Its eyes glowed faintly, their intensity alien but familiar. They stared back at me, not with fear but with hunger. The itching was gone. The weight, the sickness, the exhaustion, all gone. What replaced it was sharper, stronger, undeniable. I flexed my fingers, now black and fluid, watching them ripple and contract. Beautiful living shadows. The old skin on the floor quivered, lifeless and grotesque, a shed chrysalis. These weren't warnings. They weren't signs of decay or disease. They were preparations. I hadn't been dying. I'd been transforming. The knife dangled in my hand, forgotten as I gazed down at the heap of who I'd been. My lips curled into a smile, sharper and wider than it had ever been before. I turned away from the old me, opened the door, and stepped out into the waiting night. The doctor. It's surprising how much people will argue with me about this simple fact. Oh, definitely not. They're too reasonable, too smart, and too calm in a crisis to engage with something as irrational as superstitions. Some will even fight with me about it for an absurd amount of time, as if I wouldn't know. Me, an EMT myself, 4 generations of emergency medical professionals in my family, with both of my parents working for decades as paramedics, and a long list of other relatives that work either in the hospital or in an ambulance, and they think I wouldn't know. It's never a matter of source, though. They don't doubt for a second that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to an actual medical emergency, and graciously defer to my morbid expertise when it comes to matters of the body. There are no arguments when we step foot in the hospital or watch an ambulance pull up before us. It's just the superstitions that they can't take my word on. I guess it makes them uncomfortable, the idea that these emergency responders are superstitious. They don't want to sit in the back of an ambulance one day, in critical condition, relying on someone who believes in ghosts. They don't want to wonder if the only person that can get them to the hospital alive is worried about the full moon above, or the thought of a black cat across their path. So I let the issue drop. But for the record, some paramedics do avoid picking up shifts on the full moon. My parents told me all about the folklore of EMS. How you don't say the Q word on shift. How the full moon is always a busy night for them. How you can't go on duty expecting to be able to sleep or read, because you'll be sure to get a million calls if you do. You have to sleep with your boots on and your stethoscope on your neck before you rest your eyes and be pleasantly surprised when you wake up to your relief crew at the end of your shift. If you run out of a supply and don't restock it right away, you're sure to need it desperately on your next call. And, never ever try to dine in at a restaurant while you're on duty. You'll be called out before you can even finish ordering. I don't think they ever meant to scare us with these little superstitions. They had plenty of other stories for that. We called them the Little White Coffin stories. They functioned like the original Grimm's fairy tales, a plethora of dark and at times sinister tales meant to keep us safe from things that could hurt us. They established and explained the most important rules we had to follow. You shouldn't hang upside down on the monkey bars. Don't jump between rocks at the park. No riding your bike out of the neighborhood alone. Stay far, away from the wheels and back of the school bus. No hard candy until you're older. You absolutely can't wear Heelys. No bubblegum machine bouncy balls, even if they're only a quarter. We would ask why, and Mom would gently but firmly explain that she had treated a young patient, a child about our age, who had fooled around with such hazards. And you know what happened? Mom would ask. Their mom had to buy a little white coffin to bury them in. Morbid, definitely. But I never tried to swallow a bouncy ball and kept to the neighborhood when I went out to play. I survived long past those threats, and as I grew up, so did the Little White Coffin stories. They'd warn us about the dangers of wandering around dark cities at night, the perils waiting in the woods, not only at the hands of wild animals, but at the bottom of steep cliffs ringed by slippery walking paths when traveled alone. They fervently warned us against the street drugs they often saw on the job. I remember one night when I was a junior in high school, when my mom had burst through the door after a particularly difficult call. She questioned me, panicked, about any friends I might have had that could have been pushing me to go to parties and try things. It wasn't until I had thoroughly assured her of my relative unpopularity that she relaxed and explained that she spent the last hour of her night trying to resuscitate one of my own classmates after an apparent overdose. He thought it was just weed. But they're lacing it with something horrible nowadays, she explained, shaken. It took 5 rounds of compressions to get a pulse back. It was hard not to wonder who had been her patient when I returned to school on the following Monday. I'll admit I listened a little closer during attendance, in case there was a name missing. My parents' stories got much more detailed once I earned my EMT certificate. I gained access to a lot of brand new Little White Coffin stories after I started on the truck, like I had become a peer to confide in, as well as a daughter to protect. It's like they were trying to brace me, to prepare me for the worst things I could see on the job. I took their stories to heart and even gained a few of my own. After a few years, I didn't think they could say anything about EMS that would faze me. So when my mom mentioned that there was one story she had held back, fearing it to be too unsettling, I have to admit my stomach dropped a bit. She explained that she had neglected to share it, worried that I would be afraid to go anywhere near the hospital if she told me when I was younger. But I was much older the day she revealed this, and this is the story she told me. When my mom was a young paramedic, she worked for a hospital located in the mountainous woods of northern New Jersey. Most of the time, when people think of New Jersey, they think of the area surrounding New York City, with its sprawling urban streets and cushion of brightly lit suburbs. In truth, the entire state is pretty densely populated, but there are dark, isolating sections of the state that make you wonder just how populated they could actually be. You wonder just how much could be hidden in the trees out there, far away from the bright lights and safe din of the city. The hospital my mom worked for at the time was, and still is, relatively small. It only has 2 actual hospital buildings with emergency rooms, situated close to the suburbs, but its paramedics were expected to serve the large rural areas to the north, with just as much speed and quality of care as the area immediately surrounding the hospitals. So, like hermit crabs finding abandoned shells to nest in, the hospital made a habit of renting old, unused medical complexes for their paramedics to use as their quarters while on duty. Stationing them far away from the main buildings allowed the hospital to extend its reach into North Jersey. This is how my mom found herself spending long, dark nights in a vacant mining hospital, alone except for her crewmates and the chattering woods that surrounded the small building. For cost reasons, the hospital chose to leave the rest of the facility unused, maintaining a small office area for the crew to post up in, though it was well furnished with cots, lazy boys, a microwave, a refrigerator, and easy access to a private bathroom. The bright light of the added lamps did nothing to ease the feeling that they were disturbing a place that had been dormant for quite some time, and probably should have stayed that way. But the old hospital space was needed once again to provide aid to the community. Locals had reported enterprising individuals breaking into the nearly abandoned building, so security guards were hired to patrol the area and ensure the crew could return to their quarters without fear. The security team walked through the building, constantly during the day, watching for curious explorers and potential squatters. They had been initially hired to patrol the entire building at night as well, in a valiant effort to reassure the paramedics of their own safety. This practice was resoundingly vetoed by said paramedics on their very first night in the hospital. The well-meaning security guards shined their bright flashlights into the startled, irritated faces of the medics on duty, waking them up and prompting a string of creative expletives as they expressed their displeasure, so the security guards left them alone. Mom would see them patrolling around the building in their car and checking the other rooms with their bright flashlights, but they were careful to skip the medic quarters each night. Mom was stationed there for months and grew familiar with the echoing silence of the empty halls, the creaking and settling of the old building. Watching the glow of the flashlights drifting between beds in the old patient ward across the building, just barely visible through the windows of her quarters, was soothing, in spite of the little bit of anxiety poking the back of her mind, likely a nagging fear that the guards would unexpectedly wake them up again. It was nice to feel looked after on the long, dark nighttime shifts. Emergency medicine, in spite of its inherent dependence on teamwork, has an uncanny, isolating effect on most responders. There was this expectation, as my mom had experienced it, that you had to bear your burdens alone. Keep your scene under control, your ambulance clean, and your patient alive. It was and still is an exhausting job, and it demanded a lot of energy from the paramedics posted in that old building. The deepest hours of the night would settle into a warm, delicate silence as each medic snuck a short nap in between calls. Boots at the ready, bundled in their heavy uniform coats, staving off the ambient anxiety that being on duty imbued them with. They curled up on different bunks and couches, and they rested. It was on a night like this that my mom first saw something truly strange. She lay in her bunk, kept awake with the fear of missing a call and the persistent snoring of her partner. She felt grimy, still thinking about the filth she encountered during their last call, which occurred at a hoarder's house. They had barely spent any time in the house itself, quickly moving their patient to the warmth and safety of the ambulance. Still, Mom couldn't shake the memory of the maggot-infested plates of rotten food that balanced precariously atop carefully curated piles of newspapers, plastic lawn chairs, and bags of clothing that stood as tall as she was. The breadcrumb, trails of mouse poop that lead from these platters and down to the floor, didn't do anything to ease her mind. It was the kind of detail that Mom would often catch on scene, a quality that made her an excellent paramedic and made it difficult to move on from such a vivid call. She resigned herself to what was shaping up to be a sleepless night and crept out of her bunk. She would just have to grit her teeth and get through the rest of the shift, resolving to scrub as much of herself as she could without actually taking a shower. Maybe she'd read a bit, or maybe the partial cleanse would soothe her enough to fall asleep. She snuck into the bathroom, a small single-seater with the added benefit of a shower stall, a luxury that called to Mom as she slipped inside and closed the door silently behind her. She turned the sink on, silently thanking God for keeping the plumbing of the old building intact. Mom watched the steam rise up from the sink, admiring the plumes swirling in the cool, dry air of the bathroom for a moment. She didn't want to spend too long watching the mirror fog. She rolled her sleeves up as high as they could go, turned the cold tap a bit to ensure she wouldn't be scalded, and dove in. The hot water and cheap hand soap had exactly the effect Mom was hoping it would have. The second her hands hit the water, her entire body relaxed a bit. She washed her hands and forearms like she was scrubbing in for surgery, digging under each and every fingernail, squishing the soap between her fingers, sweeping the bubbles over her elbows and awkwardly sticking them under the tap to rinse it all off. It immediately improved her outlook on the rest of the night. She chased this newly restored peace, washing her face, wetting her hair slightly before braiding it back tight against her skull, even stripping her boots and socks off and washing what she could of her feet and calves. Finally satisfied, she sat back and took in the carnage of her sink shower. Discarded paper towels littered the area immediately surrounding the garbage can, which was already overflowing when she started this clandestine bath, while she had done her best to keep the room fairly dry. A few small puddles of water reflected on the slick tiles around the sink, which was thoroughly drenched. Steam filled the room, condensing thickly on the mirror as it rose from the tap, which was still pushing out wonderfully hot water at full blast. Mom shut the sink off, stopping the flow of water. She hadn't realized how loud the rush of the water had been, echoing in the small room until it was gone. She finished drying off, put her boots back on, and opened the door to allow the bathroom to dry out as she finished tidying up. Cold air rushed into the bathroom as Mom collected her discarded paper towels, using them to mop up the puddles she had left on the floor and sink before shoving them into the garbage can. She pressed hard on the pile of towels, compressing them, enough to tie off the black garbage bag within. She tugged hard on the bag to try and free it from the can, but the vacuum of air within was working against her. It took an embarrassing amount of wiggling and yanking, but she finally pulled the bag free from the can. Stepping back, triumphant, she turned away from the garbage can. She glanced back at the mirror and jumped out of her skin. A figure stood directly behind her in the reflection, looking over her shoulder, identity obscured by the condensation. Mom spun around, swearing. She assumed one of the other paramedics had crept up on her, either her partner or one of the men on the other ambulance unit stationed there with them. But when she turned around, there was no one there. She was initially confused, but quickly became irritated. Clearly, one of the members of the brain trust she worked with was trying to tease her. She was intimately familiar with this brand of jackassery, having been both the victim and perpetrator of a number of EMS jokes. Elaborate pranks, running, gags, morbidly hilarious uses of cadaver brains and intubation kits. She'd seen it all, and she was not in the mood for any of it at the moment. Mom grabbed the garbage bag and swept out of the bathroom, looking around the main room to see which idiot had decided to sneak up on her in the middle of the night. Her partner continued snoring away in the bunk where Mom left her. Around the corner of the angled room, Mom could see both men in the other unit still nestled under their blankets and coats. The only activity in the room was the gentle sway of the oscillating space heater and the glow of the television, which showed only a blank blue screen. Mom considered the relative innocence of the other paramedics, as well as the bad luck she would absolutely summon if she woke them up for any reason but an impending emergency call. She huffed. They earned a wake-up call, she decided. One of them had spooked her in the middle of the night at their spooky-ass building, and now they were pretending to be asleep in order to escape her wrath. She started walking towards her partner, ready to poke her awake, when she heard something. The sound of running water stopped her in her tracks. She stood there, confused. Hadn't she turned the water off? She was certain she remembered. Turning the water off. She dropped the garbage bag by the door to their quarters and went back into the bathroom. Sure enough, the hot water sprayed into the sink basin on full blast, as billowing steam rose up once again. Mom considered the tap for a moment, the malevolent prank now forgotten before she reached forward and turned it off. She twisted the valves hard, already trying to explain the phenomenon away. She returned to her bunk, now blissfully drowsy. Sitting on the thin mattress, she racked her brain, trying to remember when she had turned the sink back on and why. It was as she considered some faint desire to wash her hands again, after handling the garbage bag, that she heard it. A small creak, too quiet to wake any of the sleeping paramedics, came from the bathroom. A second later, the sound of flowing water rose up again. Mom leapt off her bunk and crossed to the bathroom, eyes bugging out of her head as she reached the door. She peeked carefully into the room just in time to see the hot water handle twisting, completely on its own, before it went still. She stood there for a moment, staring at the running water, awake with fear. Her mind raced, trying desperately to find a reasonable explanation for what she just saw. Nothing came to her. She stepped up to the basin, trying to ignore the figure once again lurking over her shoulder in the mirror's reflection. As she washed her hands one more time, she turned the tap off, dried her hands, and used the paper towel to turn the light off as she left the bathroom behind. Mom sat on her bunk staring at the open bathroom door. Hours later, as the sun rose and signaled the end of her shift, her partner awoke to find Mom sitting there, still staring at the empty bathroom. "Good morning," Lauren said, swinging her legs off the bed and rubbing her eyes. "Did you sleep?" Mom said nothing at first, brow still furrowed in concentration. "Corinne?" Lauren prompted. Mom looked at her friend, still thinking. "Yeah, a little, I think." Lauren grunted, rising to stretch and collect her things. Mom kept staring at the bathroom, the movement of the other medics soothing her nerves. "Hey, Lauren." Mom drew her partner's attention. She tried to think of a reasonable way to ask if she had seen a ghost in here before, or maybe if she'd had a waking dream. She finally gave up. "What's the deal with the plumbing here?" she asked instead. Ghost stories were not uncommon among emergency responders, but Mom was still reluctant to publicize the fact that she believed in them. They were quite common among volunteer ambulance squads, which could be a tricky group to align with in New Jersey EMS. While average citizens often lauded the EMTs and other responders that volunteered their time to provide free or significantly more affordable emergency medical care to their communities, there was a bit of a prejudice against them in the eyes of paid responders. Certain squads were well regarded, while others were considered completely incompetent. The perception of an inconsistent quality of care among the volunteers as a whole often encouraged a bit of a superiority complex in the paramedics and paid EMTs. Even today, EMS personnel will refer to certain providers as paid volunteers, an insult used against a paid first responder whose competency is questionable. Mom didn't want to be marked as a paid volunteer, so she didn't discuss what she had seen with any of the other paramedics who stayed in the old hospital with them. The only person she'd talked to about ghosts and hauntings with was her partner, Lauren. While Lauren didn't think a ghost could really move things or meddle with real objects and let Mom know exactly how crazy the concept was to her, she wouldn't hold it against Mom for bringing the topic up. Plus, she had been having odd dreams while stationed in that building. which, if nothing else, had some psychological implications she thought worth exploring. Still, Lauren fell asleep promptly when their unit was given the chance, dreams be damned. Mom, on the other hand, found it much harder to nap in the wake of the bathroom incident. She sat up most nights, watching the flashlight bob through the ward, listening to Lauren's gentle snoring. She tried to explain it away, even going so far as to look into misbehaving sinks, to see if anyone else had an issue with their tap spontaneously turning on. The only cases she found like hers were in discussions around paranormal activity. While this did nothing to soothe her anxiety, eventually the sleep she was losing caught up with her. Though she worked the night shift, the rest of the world demanded her attention during the day, and left her too tired to be kept awake by ghost stories and malfunctioning plumbing. It wasn't long until she was able to doze off between calls, once again. One dark night, nestled in the cocoon of her blankets brought from home, Mom slept soundly. It had been a long day, trudging through the midwinter chill on an endless parade of errands, and Mom slipped into a deep sleep the moment she laid her head down. Time slipped by quickly while the paramedics slept. An early sunset gave way to a clear evening sky, stars emerging from the inky blue expanse of the heavens as the night wore on. Unbeknownst to them, the swaying beam of a flashlight appeared in the window of the old ward on the far end of the hospital. It worked its way slowly through the building, room by room, as the moon dragged across the sky. Eventually, the flashlight shone on the door to the medics' quarters. It glanced across the sleeping forms of the paramedics, who remained undisturbed. It wandered around the room, illuminating stray boots, books open and face down to keep the reader's place, and extra snacks taken from hospital break rooms scattered around the space. One of their radios chirped quietly, too quietly to wake any of the paramedics. The volume had been lowered too far, an oversight that the sleeping medics remained unable to remedy as the flashlight beam fell on the radio. "Hey, look alive!" Mom stirred, an insistent whisper waking her up. She kept her eyes closed, trying to hold on to the last few moments of sleep. She was working with Lauren that night, she remembered. So surely the man she heard speaking was actually talking to his own partner. The voice spoke again. "Wake up." It felt like it was mere inches from her ear. Fear jolted her, melting quickly, into anger as she sat up, ready to give the other medic a piece of her mind. The other 3 occupants of the room lay in their bunks, still fast asleep. Mom looked around for a moment, trying to understand what woke her up. But all was still. A few moments later, the radio chirped. 52, the dispatcher asked quietly. Mom's stomach flipped as she got out of her bed and crossed to the walkie. 52 here, she replied. She turned that moment over in her mind as she roused Lauren, got her things together, and loaded them into the ambulance. She tried to convince herself that she'd heard the dispatcher over the radio calling to her, waking her up. But the deep baritone voice that woke her up sounded nothing like the gentle soprano that described the emergency they were responding to. Not long after that night, the medic unit was moved once again. Things were always changing as the hospital acquired and sold buildings around the county, so this was nothing new. Mom and the other paramedics who had been stationed in the old mining hospital were soon redistributed to other units throughout the area, occasionally bumping into each other and speculating idly about the strange things they witnessed in the old building. One day, they decided to reach out to the security personnel who had patrolled their rickety hospital. The men had watched over them after all, and been kind enough to do so even after getting an earful about waking the sleeping medics. The guards and the paramedics laughed and chattered together at a bar not too far from the old hospital, basking in the joy of a shared evening off. "Hey, by the way," Lauren said in a quiet moment. "Thanks for letting us sleep. It was reassuring to see you guys sweeping the rest of the building." The guards looked perplexed. "What are you talking about?" one asked. Lauren furrowed her brow. "I'm talking about your patrols. How you didn't wake us up again when you did your walkthroughs." "Oh, we didn't do any more walkthroughs," the younger of the 2 guards said offhandedly, finishing his drink. The more senior guard explained. "After we realized you guys were occupying that wing, we just checked all the other doors and did a drive-by. Most nights, we didn't even Go into the building, let alone sweep the halls." He leaned forward, looking concerned. "Did you see any other signs of possible intruders?" Mom's blood went cold. "We definitely saw you," she insisted. "We saw a flashlight every night, all night, going from room to room and checking everything out." Lauren backed her up. "We didn't hear any glass breaking, no alarms going off, nothing like that. Who else would go wandering through a stupid, empty building every single night?" The mood shifted. The older guard breathed a sigh of relief and relaxed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, that," he said, taking a swig from his glass. "That's just the doctor." The younger guard suddenly grew uncomfortable, tensing, up and rapping on his nearly empty bottle of beer. "What, doctor?" Lauren pressed, irritation growing in her chest. The older guard groaned as he settled back in his chair, leaning his arm against the bar top. Back when that was an active hospital, way back when, it pretty much only serviced the mine and occasionally the surrounding town. It was the only hospital most of those people would ever see, but it was still too small and remote to pull a full staff away from one of the bigger hospitals down in Morris County. The staff they did have worked every day, sometimes around the clock. Just a few nurses, some housekeepers, and at least one doctor. The younger guard started tearing bits of paper off of the label of his bottle as the older guard continued. He wasn't the only doctor that worked up here as far as we know, but he might as well have been for all he did for the area. He lived right next door to the hospital, but most nights that was still too far away for him. They kept a cot set up for him, right there in the sick bay. He watched over the miners like they were his own kids. He took a swig from his bottle. Now, at the time, there was still this prevailing belief that women should go home at night. They should rest their weary feminine legs after their grueling jobs, which of course they still shouldn't have had. He looked pointedly at Lauren and Mom with an exaggerated accusatory stare, who snickered and rolled their eyes. So he would usually shoo the nurses away at night and conduct rounds himself. The only thing he carried with him was an old flashlight, sneaking through the halls in his slippers, looking through patient charts and noting vitals by the light of his lamp. He sighed, bringing the bottle to his lips again. He died right there in his cot, passing away quietly in his sleep. Some people say that it was one of the patients who noticed, woken up by the absence of his hand on their wrist. Others think it was one of the nurses who realized what happened when he wasn't there in the morning, greeting her with his diligent report. The group sat quietly for a moment, silently honoring the loss of a provider in the line of duty. But, the guard continued, he never clocked out. The young security guard looked away. "We've been getting reports for years about a break-in with no alarm triggered. Some passerby watches the flashlight bob through the halls of the hospital and assumes it's a curious teenager, so they call the cops. The cops find nothing and scold the caller for wasting their time. After enough distinct calls, the property owners eventually hired us to keep the kids out. But it was never kids. It was never anyone but the doctor. He tries to help." The younger guard finally spoke, startling the medics. "You'll be walking through the hospital after an alarm trip and hear this voice whisper behind you, in the basement, and you'll go down and find a bum who broke a window and sliced his hand good. You'll be patrolling, and he'll thump you in the chest, stopping you, just as a ceiling tile crashes down in front of you." He looked shyly at the two women. "You'll go to shine your flashlight in the new medic quarters and hear him say a scoundrel." Whatever that means, the paramedics were dead silent considering this story. "I mean," Mom's co-worker John eventually said, "at least he's trying to help. Paramedics are incredibly superstitious. I understood that long before Mom told me this story, but I didn't realize just how superstitious they could be." As Mom finished her story, she studied me, watching my face carefully. I laughed at first, assuming she was hazing me or something like that. I had just started volunteering on an ambulance squad that our family had been on for generations, so I figured that this was simply a new member ritual I hadn't heard about yet. "Did you get to see the doctor again?" I asked, eyes glimmering with the joy of a new story. "No." Mom shook her head, deathly serious. "That building ended up being abandoned. but I wanted to tell you about him so you weren't surprised on your first overnight shift. I crossed my arms. I've been on overnight shifts before. She shot me a look I was familiar with, the yeah, right look that dripped with unspoken sarcasm. A real overnight shift, at a real squad building with its own ghosts. I massaged my neck, trying to understand what she was getting at. What? Like mom? Perhaps this whole story was an allegory to remind me to respect the accrued experience of the first responders who came before me, especially the ones in our family, like my late grandmother. Nah. Mom waved her hand dismissively. My mom's not haunting the squad house, but someone is, and he'll be keeping an eye on you, so you had better be on your best behavior. All right, Mom, I chuckled. I'll be good. I forgot about Mom and the doctor as the evening sank into night. My shift was fairly uneventful, with only a few calls early on, and I was fortunate enough to grab a few hours of sleep. I wasn't thinking about ghosts as the moon rose in the sky, crossing the shiny wooden flooring of the room I dozed in. But I did hear something that, being such a light sleeper, woke me up in the wee hours of the morning. A squeak, like work boots sliding against the hardwood floor. As I drifted into consciousness, I heard a voice, a gruff male voice, right in my ear. Hey, it grunted, come on up. My eyes flew open, and I shot bolt upright in bed, ready to apologize to a senior squad member about whatever call I had clearly slept through. But I was alone. My partner snored in the next room over, the only other sign of life in the deserted building. I was about to lie back down when I heard the tones, squeaking out far too quietly from a mobile radio set in my partner's room. We had a call to respond to. I roused my partner, laced up my boots, and tried to fathom what I had just experienced as we raced towards the emergency. I've had a few years to think about it now, and I think the answer has always been clear. Paramedics are superstitious, and now I am too.